Hi, my name is Michael Andrew, and I'm about to give you your free tutorial on the awesome Canon R5. If you are an experienced photographer or you are looking for a specific topic, we've put together a table of contents. You can hit Command F or Control F depending on the browser that you're using. Type in your topic, hit return, and it should highlight your topic in the table of contents. Hit the time code, and that will take you to the specific part of this tutorial. If you're looking for a great place to share your images and ask me questions, check out my Canon R5 users group on Facebook. It's probably the best way to connect with me in regards to the R5. I am very careful to not let trolls or negative energy in there. This is a positive, synergistic place for us to create and share ideas. I'll put that link in the description. Now, I know I'm going to get this question, why would you make a free tutorial or any tutorials for a camera of this caliber? The truth of the matter is, number one, there are beginners who will purchase the R5 who will literally know nothing about the camera. And it's kind of one of these myths that beginners shouldn't or wouldn't buy an expensive camera. My experience is that has nothing to do with it. Photographers will buy what they can afford. And so if somebody can afford a really nice high-end camera, they're going to buy it. So that's one part of it. But even advanced and experienced shooters, they want to know what the new features are. Now, if you are a beginning or an intermediate photographer, I have to give you a word of warning. This video covers the operation of the camera only. There are a lot of other things that you would need to know to maximize your creative potential, including things like the photography basics, talking about shutter speed, aperture, depth of field. There's composition, the artistic side to it. There's the lighting side to it. There's the troubleshooting part of it. And then we start looking at all the different types of shooting. We got portraits, landscapes, sports shooting, and then all the different kinds of videography. And there is a synergistic way to put these all together. Now, the reason why I tell you that is I am putting together an awesome Canon R5 crash course. So if you find this video helpful and you want to cut to the chase and learn those techniques as quickly as possible, check for the link in the description. It will take you to my blog. If it's published, the link will be there. But if it's not published, leave your name and your email address, and we will notify you as soon as the crash course is finished. I also listen to feedback from you guys and add lessons. So 100% money back guarantee. This is the fastest way to learn your camera. In any event, we have a tremendous amount of information to cover, so let's get started. Before I put a lens on, I want to show and point out a few features on the front of the camera that you'll probably be wondering about. This little button here is the depth of field preview button, and what it does is it stops the aperture blades down to the aperture that you're about to shoot in, and it allows you to preview the depth of field in real time. We have our infrared remote sensor. Just inside of the shutter button right here, we have the low light autofocus assist lamp. When you first get your camera, by default, it'll probably be turned on, and there's a way to turn this off. Next to that, we have the microphone. We have the lens release we're about to talk about, and we also have a remote terminal underneath this rubber gasket. Allow us to connect a little remote control cable to the camera to activate certain features like taking a picture. Now, the cover for the lens mount, you'll notice that it has this little tick mark here, and when you rotate it and it comes to the top, you'll notice that there is a corresponding red dot. That red dot is going to match your RF lenses and is the alignment point. So when you put a lens on, you're going to align it and rotate it. As you know, the Canon R cameras have a feature that shut the shutter blades when the camera is turned off to prevent dust from getting onto the sensor. I'm a big fan of the 24-105 f4. It's a very sharp lens. I've had a couple of them in my career. They're always very sharp. I know you can't see it very well. There's the red dot. I'm going to line this up and rotate it until it clicks. So a couple things I want to point out real quick. Obviously, when you take a lens off of the camera body, you're going to push the lens release and rotate the lens. Always make sure you hear that little click when you put it on. And another thing is that we live in a microbe world where there's little dust particles and things floating around in the air at all times. And what will happen eventually at some point, you will get a dust particle on your sensor. Now, there are some automatic sensor cleaning features on most cameras. It's a little filter that vibrates when you turn the camera on or off. In some cases, you will have to physically clean that off of the sensor, and I will demonstrate how to do this on the crash course. It's pretty I know it's nerve-wracking, but if you have the right tools, it's really not that bad. One word of advice is that you kind of want to avoid changing your lenses in very windy environments. And another thing that I do and recommend to my students is that when you change the lenses, face the camera body down. And that will actually prevent a lot of dust from getting in there, and it will lengthen the time between cleanings. Another thing I want to point out is that every lens cap, almost every lens cap, underneath you'll have a little filter size. In this case, the filter size is 77 millimeters, and that refers to the front filter mount. And you'll need to know that when you start threading filters on. This is how you find it. Talking about the left side of the camera features, you'll notice on the lens barrel we have an autofocus, manual focus switch. Sometimes you're going to want to manual focus, and you just literally flip it on the lens, flip it back forward, really straightforward. And we also have the optical image stabilization. That refers to the stabilizer in the lens, and we have IBIS in the camera body. However, when you put them together, the camera sees them as the same thing. So if you turn off the stabilizer, you're turning off both of them. While we're here, let's talk about these gaskets on the side. We have several gaskets. If you remove the top one, we have a microphone input right here. If you're doing any kind of video recording, you're going to want an external microphone because your audio quality is going to be a lot better. And then we have a headphone jack to monitor that audio. Below these, we have a PC sync terminal. This port will allow you to plug directly into a studio strobe in order to trigger that strobe. Underneath this gasket, we have our digital terminal. It's your USB port. You can see it right there. And we also have our HDMI out, which is sending audio and video signal out of the camera. There's a little screw thread right here for the cable holder. Now you can charge batteries in the camera. You can even charge 2 batteries at a time in the grip. Canon wants you to have the camera off when you start charging. When you turn the camera on, that interrupts the charging flow. And there is even a power adapter that you can plug into the battery port and have unlimited power plugged into the wall. Let's talk about memory cards real quick. There is a short answer and there's a much longer answer. In the beginning, I highly recommend SanDisk's Extreme Pro memory cards. I have more of these than any other memory card. They are very reliable. The last time I had a problem with any SanDisk was 2009, 2010. Haven't had a problem with them since. This is a UHS 2 memory card. You can tell because we have 2 sets of pins on the back. Now, the R5 is very high performance. It is capable of writing an incredible amount of data to the memory card. And when you get these high performance cards, for the most part, you're not going to have any problems with shooting stills in most of the video settings using a memory card like this. It's very affordable. I have 128 gigabytes. You'll also notice that there is a little icon in here that it looks like a U with the number 3 in it. That is the minimum sustained writing standard for 4K video at 30 frames per second. So you want to have that. What I'm saying is you can't really put a slow memory card into the R5 and expect to not have any interruptions or problems. So there's an orientation notch on the side here. We're going to put that into the camera until it clicks, and then we know it's in there. The rule of thumb for my students that I tell them is to get the biggest, fastest memory cards that you can afford. It's a really good idea to have a backup if you're doing any kind of professional work, and you can see this empty slot for a CF Express Type B. Now, there is a little bit longer of an answer that I have to give you, is that when you are purchasing memory cards, it will give you different data rates, and it will give it to you in megabytes with a big B. Very important, because when we're talking about the video recording data rate, that is typically given in megabits, which is a little b. If you want to take advantage of the 8K raw video, we're talking about 2,600 megabits per second. We have to use a CF Express B card that can match that speed, and the way we convert that is we divide it by 8. So we have 8 bits for every megabyte. 2,600 divided by 8 is 325 megabytes per second. And that is faster than what our little SD card can handle. Those files are also going to be huge. So if you plan on doing, a lot of video recording, you're going to need a couple of those cards. I'm waiting for mine to arrive in the mail. At the time of this recording, there are some heating problems with the R5. I don't know how Canon's going to address it. I don't see the R5 as a primary video camera because of these heating issues, but there are going to be many times I will want to record an 8K video raw, even just to check it out. So I have to have a memory card that can keep up with those data rates. Let's talk about the battery real quick. It's a new type of battery. So this is Canon's new battery. It's the LP-E6NH. Notice it has a little sticker here on the side. Backwards compatible. You can use the older Canon batteries. They're the same shape, LP6N. And another thing I want to point out, you'll notice you have these pins. These are going to go towards the top to the inside of the camera body. You will also notice that we have this little port here. It almost looks like an HDMI port. It is not an HDMI port. If I'm not mistaken, this is the communications port for the battery grip. We can purchase an additional battery grip that will allow us to use 2 more batteries. This is going to slide in here. You will also notice that this little cover on the bottom, there's a switch here, and we can take this cover off by moving this switch over to the left. And when we take that off, it's going to create some room for the battery grip to move in to this, and then we connect it. Very cool feature. And then putting it back on is in the opposite direction. Slide that over, it's in there. Let's talk about some of the top of the camera buttons and features and controls. Obviously, we have the shutter button. So the shutter button has a few positions. A lot of people think you just grab it and push it down and that's all there is to it. But most modern cameras, there is a halfway position. It's this spongy, very soft resistance. And when the camera is on and you have autofocus activated, you'll hear a beep by default. You can hear the autofocus kicking in. If we were to turn this to manual focus, there's no beep. Very worth your time to train your finger to feel where that spongy resistance point is, and when you want to take a picture, you push it down all the way. If we were on a burst mode, taking multiple frames per second, let's say we're taking 12 mechanical frames per second, we would push and hold the shutter button down, and the camera would continuously take those images. You'll notice on the inside of the lens here, we have a lens barrel lock. This is a big, heavy lens, and sometimes when you're carrying it, the lens might creep, and so this allows you to lock the lens from moving. Obviously, we have the power switch. This little symbol here indicates the depth of where the sensor is in the camera body. So this lines up exactly where the sensor is, and I've used it many times in my little scientific tests to measure the distance and things of that nature. Obviously, we have the flash hot shoe terminal. This little guy right here, I like to call it the primary selector. Canon calls it the main dial. The reason I prefer to call this the primary selector is because of our index finger, numero uno. And when we put our index finger on the primary selector, usually it is going to change the primary camera setting depending on what mode we are using. And I'll point those out when we go through that lesson. But you're going to be changing a lot of settings and controls with this top main control dial. To the left of the main control dial, we have the multi-function button, the MFN button, and this will allow us to pull up a small menu of features while we are shooting. We can change. I will demonstrate that when we get to the back of the camera. We have our start and stop video record button. We have our LCD illuminator. So if we turn this on in a dark situation, it is going to allow us to see the information on our LCD display here. We have the lock feature, and we can program certain features to lock on the camera. If we have our camera set up just the way we want and we don't want to bump the settings, we can activate the lock. I would be mindful of this button from accidentally pressing it, because if we accidentally press it and we don't really know, then we've locked certain controls. In the center of the secondary controller, we have the mode button. So when we press this, we are going to see a submenu of our modes that we can scroll through using the rear control wheel. We can also activate the touch screen. We get a little option there. So that's how we control our modes. So real quick, let's talk about some of this information. We have the current mode we're shooting in, our battery charge, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Those 3 sets of information you are going to see pretty much in every viewfinder of every camera. They're just put in different places, but those 3 pieces of information are going to be critical for your shooting. This little bar right here with all these tick marks, that is the exposure compensation bar. We'll be spending some time talking about what that is and how it operates. But if you continue to press the little light bulb button, we can see some of the other features that we have selected. We have our memory card in slot 2. We have the current mode for the video shooting, the frame rate, and the resolution. So this is full HD at 29.97 frames per second. Now we'll be talking about each of these features individually, but what they are is in the top left-hand corner, we have our focus square type. So it's the cluster of focusing squares that we're using. To the right of that, we have our drive mode, which is what happens after we push the shutter button down all the way. We have our white balance setting. We have our focusing mode, which is different than the squares we're using. We're talking about focusing in depth. We have our metering mode. I'll be demonstrating what metering mode is. And then we have our picture styles. Picture styles essentially are recipes for making JPEG images. It's telling the camera what to keep and what to throw away. If we had a second memory card in there, we would also be able to see that. And this little arrow indicator is going to point to which one you are currently writing to. Let's talk about some of the features in the MFN button in regards to the LCD monitor. It's a really great way they set this up. It's very intuitive, is that the rear control wheel will allow you to select different options, and the primary selector will allow us to move through the settings of those features. So when I press this, you can see that we get these little boxes on the bottom that tell us of the different features that we have. And if I want to change any of those features within it, I would rotate the top. If I wanted to change any of those features, I would rotate my primary selector. While we are here, I would strongly recommend changing from auto ISO. I'm not a fan of that by default. I only use it in certain situations. I'm going to put it to ISO 400 right now. If I wanted to change another feature like the drive mode, I could do it here. And we have little icons. I'll be explaining what these each mean in just a minute here. Here's our focusing mode. Here's our white balance types and the exposure compensation. So in the beginning, it's going to feel a little weird, but you have the option to look at your camera on the top view, on the back monitor, through the electronic viewfinder, and you're going to be seeing all these symbols and features as we manipulate the MFN button. I also want to point out that we can toggle through the different features by just pushing the MFN button. So we can toggle through each of those features. It comes down to preference, and that's something that I love about the R5 is we have lots of different options to view and to change the settings of our camera. Let's talk about some of the buttons and controls on the back of the camera. If you look in the manual, it can be pretty confusing in terms of which button Canon is talking about. When they say quick control dial 2, they're talking about this thing. When they're talking about quick control dial 1, they're talking about this guy. The important thing is to know the differences between these if you are looking in the manual, because otherwise you will get confused. So this is quick 2, this is quick 1. Next to the viewfinder, you'll see this little black box here. That is a switch that when we raise the camera to our eye, it'll detect it and it will turn off, if we have the settings set up right, it'll turn off the monitor and turn on the EVF. That's the way I prefer to have it. To the right, immediate right of the viewfinder, we have this little knob here. This is called our diopter adjustment. If you wear corrective eyewear and you want to adjust the focus of the EVF, this is where we do it. On the back of the camera in the far top left, we have the rate button, which will allow us to designate a 1 through 5-star rating to our images. And you will also know that we have a little record button there. It's a little microphone, and this is going to allow us to attach audio files to our images. To the right of that, we have the deep menu button. We'll be spending quite a bit of time going through the deep menu. Check the table of contents if you want to jump through that. To the far right of the viewfinder, we have the joystick. I just call it the joystick. There's different names for it. This is very useful for changing the position of our focusing squares. I am a left-eye dominant shooter, and in some of the past Canon R series cameras, they wanted us to focus using the touch monitor. My nose would be hitting this. And so if you're a left-eyed shooter, this is absolutely going to be your friend. I think most people prefer a joystick anyway. So we can select where the position of our autofocus points are. Pushing it into the camera body typically resets it. and I'll be showing you how to set this up so you don't have to push any other buttons. You can just push it and go to the focusing points. To the right of the joystick, we have the auto focus on button. If you're doing sports shooting, as many of you are, you can engage our focusing using this rear button instead of using the halfway shutter button depression of the shutter button. To the right of that, this little star icon designates exposure lock. So for example, for shooting in the program mode, shutter priority, or aperture priority mode, this is going to lock the exposure settings so they don't change. It is also the flash exposure lock button if we are shooting with a speed light. To the right of that, we have a little box that has these little tick marks in it. I like to refer to this as the cluster button because when we push it, we can change our auto focusing clusters and the type of focusing squares we're using in the viewfinder or the back monitor. Magnify button obviously is going to allow us to zoom in. We can zoom in while we are shooting. If we want to get a tack sharp focus, we can also zoom in onto our images after we take the shot. We have our information display button. We have our cue button. Then we have the play button, obviously, to play back images. And we have the garbage can icon, which obviously deletes images. This little light will turn on when the camera is recording to the memory card. Just want to make sure we've covered everything. Obviously, we have a great articulating touchscreen monitor. We'll be talking about this now. In my opinion, Canon is numero uno when it comes to touch monitors. Really easy to use, great features. They are the leader, I believe. Some of the other camera companies are catching up, but the touch monitor is awesome. So let's turn this bad boy on. Obviously, I'm going to set this up. We can use the touch controls. So if we want to go up or down, we can do it this way. So once the camera's all set up, we'll hit OK and hit OK again. I want to answer a question many of you are going to have, is that when we take the monitor and we flip it out all the way and we're shooting and we look into the viewfinder, by default, this switch is not going to activate. So there is a setting that I would recommend changing, or at least knowing about, is when you come into the menu under this yellow wrench tab, page 3, screen viewfinder display. By default, it is set to auto 1. When we come in and we look at this, we're given 2 auto options, a viewfinder option and a screen option. The auto 1 setting basically means is that when you swing the monitor out and you look into the viewfinder, this is not going to turn on. So I kind of prefer the auto switching, which means if I am shooting with it out here, I can still look through the EVF and it'll turn on. There are times you are going to want to have the back monitor on only, and we would come down to the screen option. And there may be some times you only want the viewfinder on. So this setting controls how the monitors in the auto switch works. Again, I'm kind of a fan of this second one. We double tap and then we tap the shutter button to get it out. If you do not have your camera in hand, I would definitely recommend getting it, especially when we get into the exposure and the focusing lessons. And another thing you should be very familiar with is what happens when you push the info button. So just sit there and press through the information button, and you're going to notice that you will scroll through several different kinds of screens with different sets of information. I'll walk you through what this information is. But just know this is how it operates. You're going to be pressing that quite a bit. I'm going to jump into manual mode real quick so you can see all the settings in this first page here. Let's talk about some of the basic information. Now, we get a mirror preview of what the electronic viewfinder would see. So if you were to look into the electronic viewfinder, you would see something similar. I'm going to teach from the back monitor. It's easier. On the bottom, and this is the case with most modern cameras, you're going to see your 3 most important inputs, which are your shutter speed, usually given in fractions. So in this case, 1/100th of a second. Your aperture, in this case, 5.6. And we also have our ISO. Something that's really cool is that we get these orange icons next to those settings, which tells us how we can change them. So in the case of this half banana shaped object, that is the primary selector on top. When we're talking about this full circle, it is the rear control wheel. Sometimes I call this the secondary selector because it changes the secondary setting. And we also have what Canon refers to as the quick 2 dial. I will sometimes call this the thumb wheel. So we have our primary selector, our secondary selector, our rear control wheel. or our thumb wheel right here, quick 2. The good thing about this video is you can literally see what I'm doing, and we have these icons to remind us. This bar here is referred to as the exposure compensation bracket. We'll be talking about that in depth. We have our touch shutter activation screen. So anything you see in a box on the monitor means you can touch it. We can touch and drag to change the setting. If we want to change it directly on the back monitor. As I'm getting older, my vision is starting to slip a little bit. It's easier for me to see some of those settings. On the top, in the top left-hand corner, we have the current mode that we are shooting in this case, manual mode. In the brackets, we have the number of shots remaining on this particular memory card. It's how much free memory we have. This will change according to the settings we're using for our images or the resolution. To the right of that, we have the number of shots remaining in this burst. 2959, this is referring to the length of video I can record in a single take before the camera will automatically shut off. We have our battery indicator, image stabilization indicator. It's turned to off right now. If I were to come to the front of the lens, turn that on, you can see that we get this indicator designating it as on. And then we have a Q button. We'll be talking about that in just a second. If I was to press the info button again, we get a ton of new information on the sides. Sometimes you want this information on your screen, sometimes you don't. We're going to come back to this in just a second. Pressing the info button again, we get a histogram and our digital level. You'll notice the camera is level when we see these two green indicators. If I was to tilt the camera up just a little bit, let's see if we can get this. You see these red tick marks? So that's indicating the levelness to the horizon. So there's side to side on the far sides, and there's to the horizon. And when we get green, right about there. If we were to press the info button again, we remove all of that information. We have a tracking option that we can turn on or off. We're talking about that in the focusing lesson. Let's cover the quick menu screen first, because I think these icons are easier to see when I show you them in different places. Again, in the top left-hand corner, we have which mode we're shooting in. And you'll notice we have those 3 controls again. We have our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO with orange indicators designating how we can change them. If you press this Q button in the bottom left-hand corner, or this Q button over here, this is going to open the menu that will allow us to use the touchscreen to change these features. So unless you see a box and you touch on the screen, it's not going to work. It wants us to activate the touchscreen. Now we get these gray boxes. The orange box is telling us which one we have currently selected. So there's a number of different ways we can control the settings. We can rotate any of the control wheels to change it. 3 different options. We can also touch into the menu, and we can touch and drag, we can tap. So there's tons of different ways to change it. This is preference in terms of what you prefer and like. We can do the same for our aperture and our ISO. Here's the exposure compensation indicator. Talk about exposure compensation a little later. Here we have our flash exposure compensation. So if we want to change our flash power to be brighter or darker, we can do it from the Q menu. And then we get into some of the secondary settings, things like picture styles. We're talking a little bit about that when we get into the menus. Here's our white balance. You'll notice we have all these different icons. Here's our white balance shift in brackets, something I do not recommend if you're a beginning or intermediate photographer. Don't even worry about this for right now. Here we have our auto light optimizer. It's automatically turned off in manual and bulb. This is a slight contrast adjustment. It wants me to come back in. We have our Wi-Fi modes if we want to connect to our smartphone or computer. I'll be demonstrating that a little bit later. Here we have our auto focusing clusters. We'll be spending quite a bit of time in this in the focusing lesson. I'll explain each of these and when you should use them. Then we have our focusing modes. We have either one shot or servo. I'll be explaining that as well. We have our metering modes. We have our drive, which is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way. I'll explain them real quick. Single square means it's going to take one shot and the camera's going to stop. You'll notice that we have 3 different sets of images stacked on top of each other, and these are different frame rates. So high speed continuous plus, high speed continuous, low speed continuous burst. If you're going for fast action, you're going to want one of the high speed continuous bursts. We'll be covering the sports shooting recommendations on the crash course. I'll go down to the park. I'll demonstrate how I set the camera up for sports shooting. And then we have our 2 timers. We have our 10-second, or we can use the remote to trigger it. We have our 2-second with remote. So those are the drive modes. We have our memory card indicator. This is which one we're recording to. We also have the quality, which deals with the type of file we're dealing with, whether it's a RAW file or a JPEG image. We have some other indicators on the bottom. Again, here we have the number of shots remaining, battery life indicator, Wi-Fi indicator, image stabilizer. So that is the Q mode. And there is something in here I want to point out that's really cool, is the custom button setup. So if I press Q, and I come in to this guy right here, this is going to allow us to customize either our buttons or our dials. I am going to teach the dials the way Canon has it set up on the camera. And in the beginning, I recommend learning it the default way. And I think the reminders are good too. When I am actually shooting, I prefer the dials to be a little bit different. I prefer this to be the secondary setting. So if I'm in exposure compensation, it's just preference. I don't want it to be ISO. I would prefer this to be ISO, but that's just the way that I shoot. So what I demonstrate and what your preference is going to be, it is going to change the longer you are shooting. You're gonna have your own likes and dislikes about certain controls, and this is where we can set this up. When we come into the customized buttons, you will notice that we get this map feature on the left that has a white highlight designating which button we're about to change. In the beginning, I would recommend leaving these as the defaults. And you'll notice we have 2 columns, one for still images and one for video images. And you'll notice that they're side by side the same buttons. So what Canon is allowing us to do is to customize them differently according to whether we're shooting stills or video. And when you come into each of these features, there are tons of options. So pages of different features. Eventually, you're going to want to customize these. It's just a fact of life. But the one that I do recommend turning on right now is the multi-controller, the joystick. I would turn this to direct AF point selection, and we'll be talking about this in the focusing lesson. This allows us to when we're focusing, is point that joystick in any direction that I want. Jump back to the center. Let's talk about how some of this information has changed in the video mode. Most of this is similar: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Probably the easier place to see this is in the black screen. There's a couple things in here that are different. Our audio levels. This one is important, and the reason is it allows us to set the gain control of our microphone. By default, when you get the camera, it's going to be set on auto. I would definitely recommend turning this to manual, because if you don't, the gain is going to fluctuate depending on how much sound is coming into the camera. So with manual, you can come in and turn the gain down, and what we're looking at is the audio levels here. Is you want to stay away from this red. When you see the red on the audio levels, it means the camera has clipped out. Yellow is okay, but the red is bad. So you're going to want to keep an eye on that, and also keep an eye to make sure that this says manual. Now, there are some other controls in here as well. We have an attenuator, which dampens the sound. I'm not really a fan of it. I just use, the basic audio levels, but you can also turn this on just to prevent sound from clipping out. There is a wind filter that is supposed to reduce wind noise. I've never had a lot of success with it. And another really important one right here is the resolution for the video that we're shooting on. We'll be talking about this in the menu section a little bit, but I'll be giving some demonstrations on the crash course about, why I choose one over the other. Tons of different compression settings. You can see the columns are really nice because it tells you the resolution in the top row, tells you the frame rate in the second row, and it also tells you the compression type in the bottom row. So we have the ability to go raw, all I, IPB, or compressed IPB. It's a lot to go into. Just keep in mind that on the top, we can see the resolution, dimensions. We can choose the frame rate below it. It's very logical. It's a very logical layout. Slightly different AK standard. We can go 4K, at 60 frames per second. Wish we had raw options for 4K, but we have all I, IPB. I know it's a lot to go into. It also gives you the total record time based on how much, what your memory card is capable of and how much space you have. Very nice. And when we come over, we have also the ability to turn on movie digital image stabilization. I don't really use it in camera, but it's starting to make more sense, especially when we're shooting with these huge resolutions. Digital image stabilization is giving the camera permission to essentially crop in and stabilize the image. You lose some resolution, but if you're shooting 8K, it may not make that much of a difference. So I'm looking forward to experimenting with this quite a bit. And there's even an enhanced version of it. My question is how much degradation is there? What does the quality look like? So we definitely get some different information in the video screens. If we come to the Q overlay, you can see a lot of those same settings off to the sides now. One thing that's different is we have our headphone jack. We can control the volume of the headphone jack. We can turn on HDR movie recording. Very nice. Really good. But in any event, just keep in mind that when you are on your video screen, you do have these video related features. Now that we know what those icons are, let's come to another screen. And this is the live view version of the quick menu. So we see a lot of these similar icons on the sides now. You'll notice that they're not highlighted with a box, which means if we try to touch them, we're just going to be focusing the focusing square. To gain access to these features, we're going to press this little Q. We can also obviously access it with the Q button here. And the way this works is that we have the features on the left and right columns. And once something is highlighted, we have the options on the bottom. So let's go through these real quick. We have our autofocus clusters. We have our autofocus mode. We have our image quality dealing with JPEGs or RAW images. We have our drive modes that we've already discussed. We're going to keep it on single. Our metering modes we will talk about in just a minute. We have our anti-flicker shooting. And what this does is it tells the camera to detect if we are shooting in flickering lights. It's not something that we can see with the naked eye most of the time. I have a video on this if you want to know why it happens. And this allows the camera to time the flickering to get consistently exposed and color balanced images. It's something that's you kind of have to be looking for it. You may not notice it when it's happening, but when you go back and you look at your images, you'll notice certain things like the color of the light you're shooting in is changing. Most of the time, I leave this turned off because it can interrupt, for example, the maximum frames per second, things of that nature. It's a lot of stuff to go into. But if you notice flickering lights, you can turn this on and it will assist you. We have our auto white balance. We have our picture styles, and then we have our auto light optimizer. This guy on the bottom is the cropping or the aspect ratio if we wanted to crop out the sensor. So 45 megapixels, if we didn't want to use that, we could go for a square for Instagram. And when you take the picture, it actually takes a picture of a square JPEG. It's ready to go. I personally don't recommend going with certain aspect ratios because you can always crop it in post. You'll have the full image. But there are people like my dad, for example. He loves to shoot in 16:9 for stills. There's some people who are like micro four third aspect ratio. There's people who want a 1.6 crop, APS-C size. So it just depends on what you're doing, but for the most part, full is going to be fine. So when we are done with this, we can tap the shutter button. It'll take us back out. You'll notice that when I move the focusing square, we get this guy jumping up. This is return to center. Pushing into the joystick will also do that. That's typically how I do it. But if you're just wondering what that is, it's to reset to center. Amazing coverage on the R5 in terms of how far we can focus. Top to bottom, it's incredible. It's fantastic. Push that in again. When we're talking about the touch screen, we can press playback and pinch and zoom, just like a smartphone. Zoom in or out. When we pinch in together, we start to import other images that we've already taken. If you continue to do this, the more images that you have. And when we get to the point that we have, hundreds or thousands, you'll see this, and we get the scroll bar on the right, so we can touch and drag. The touchscreen is awesome. It's wonderful. Obviously, really good for focusing. We can touch and focus. We'll be talking about that a little later. Something I want to demonstrate before we get into the modes and exposure lesson is what the MFN button looks like in the EVF or the back monitor. So when I push the MFN button down once, we get the submenus. It's giving us an indicator that's showing how we can change. We can also use this top control wheel. And again, we can change the settings within each of those features using the primary selector. So again, here are our drive modes. You'll be familiar with those icons. Here is our focusing mode we'll be talking about. We have our white balance and exposure compensation. We can also toggle pressing the MFN button. And I really love that it tells us which button to use, but we can really use both of these. Tap the shutter button. Jumping into the mode lesson. So when we push the mode button down, we have all of the available modes on the back monitor. You'll see the corresponding on the LCD. And there's a long answer and a short answer to this. The short answer is if you are first getting started, I want you to focus on aperture priority. Every camera has a dummy mode. And I say that lovingly. It really turns our camera, a very expensive camera, into a point and shoot. We still get the benefits of the large sensor, but the camera is going to be making those decisions. I do not recommend dummy mode for anybody. If you are really struggling and want the camera to help you out a bit, I would recommend program mode because you can still change a lot of your settings in program mode. But the one that I think every beginner should struggle with, even if you struggle with it for a couple days or even a week, is the aperture priority mode. We'll be going into that in a second. We also have a flexible priority mode, which is it's only on Canon R cameras, and I will be demonstrating how this works a little bit later. Some of the other modes is we have the manual mode, just like it sounds. We control every setting. We have the bulb mode, which allows us to take very long exposures, well over 30 seconds. We also have the C1, the C2, and the C3 modes. Those stand for customization modes. You'll notice that we get a little letter icon on each of those. It's telling us what mode each of those custom settings are set at. Now, if we want to jump into the dedicated video mode, it wants us to press the info button. So when we press the info button, now we're looking at the different modes for video shooting. We have a dummy video recording mode. We have a program video recording mode. When I'm shooting video, it's almost exclusively manual. There are rare occasions I will use aperture priority if I'm going from bright to dark locations quickly, indoors to outdoors, I might use that. But most of the time for video, I'm on manual mode. The crash course that I'm putting together for the R5, we're going to shoot a commercial. I'm going to demonstrate all kinds of different video shooting, vlogging, tons of information in that course. We also have our customizations for video shooting, and we want to jump back into the dedicated still shooting. We press the info button again. Now we're going to get into our exposure control lesson. This is probably the most important thing I can teach you on this video because you're going to be changing it often. Exposure is just a fancy word for brightness. So what I'm saying is this lesson will show you how to make your images brighter or darker. There is a short answer to this, and there is a much longer answer, and I'm going to give you both. And the reason I go into some of the longer answers is because, during instructionals, if I just say, hey, push this button, push that button, and then you got it, it doesn't really teach you the concept of how this works. And so I go into the philosophy of use on many of these features. That's what a lot of what the crash course is the philosophies of uses in different shooting settings. And this is why we would change it to be this. And in the past, this works far better with my students because they understand why they're doing it instead of, hey, push XYZ buttons, right? By the way, get your camera if you have it. Make sure you have it in your hands. Before we jump in there, just make sure that on the red tab, page 7, we have exposure simulation turned on. Very important. Also, make sure that you have your ISO not set on auto. Otherwise, we won't be able to see some of these examples. So again, I want you to start off on aperture priority mode. Make sure you have your camera in your hands to follow along. And I want to explain what aperture priority mode does. Aperture priority means that we dial in the aperture setting and the camera selects the shutter speed. That's how it works. The camera is going to do some of the heavy lifting for us. And when we rotate our primary control wheel, you can see the aperture is changing. The smaller the number, the wider the lens opening. The higher the number, so if we go up to f22, the smaller the opening. And I explain all this on the crash course. There's a digital photography school. It's about an hour long. It will get you through the basics really fast. So if we're opening and closing the diameter of the lens, the question should be is why is this not getting brighter or darker when we do that? Now the secret to seeing this is you tap the shutter button and now we can see the shutter speed. And as we change our aperture, you'll notice the shutter speed is changing accordingly. So if we go with a very, very small opening, the camera is using a longer and longer shutter speed. To a wider shutter speed, the camera is using a faster shutter speed. So the concept of aperture priority is that we select the size of the opening of the aperture priority, and the camera adjusts the shutter speed in order to keep it to an even exposure. So no matter what we change the aperture to, the exposure is pretty much more or less going to be the same. The question you probably have, okay, that's great. How do we make the image brighter or darker? Great question. The short answer is the exposure compensation bar right here. If we want to make, so if we take a picture, that's great, right? But let's say we want to make it brighter. Okay, this is the short answer. Come over here to the exposure compensation bar and press on a positive number, in this case, +1. I would go ahead and do this at home. Take a look at it. And when we compare those two images, you can see this one's darker and this one's brighter. So that's how we change our image brightness. We use the exposure compensation bar. If we want to make it darker, no problem. We'll go to -1. Take a picture. And that quickly, we can now control the brightness of our images in the P, TV, or AV modes. So there's the even exposure, a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. We could go to extremes if we wanted to be really dark, or we can go really, really bright. That's the short answer. So now I am going to give you the philosophy of use for aperture priority mode and exposure compensation. So what I want you to do is to tap the shutter button. And as you're doing this, I want you to take your hand and cup it over the lens. And what you will notice is that the camera is making adjustments based on the amount of light entering the camera, not what the shutter speed is. So I get this question all the time. Michael, I have my aperture at f4. Why are all my pictures blurry? And I ask them, are you shooting indoors? And they're like, yeah. It's like, okay, we'll go outside and, in the daytime and take a picture of a tree. And they're, oh, hey, it's working, great. So you need to remember that the camera is making those adjustments based on how much light is entering the camera. Okay, that's the first critical part. And because it's doing this, those shutter speeds are going to change according to the light, which means we also have to be a little bit careful. So there are a couple safe shutter speeds I want you to be aware of so that as you are shooting, you can keep an eye on them to make sure you are within the safe boundaries. The safe shutter speeds that I recommend for my students is that if you are shooting a portrait, if you're taking a picture of a person, the minimum, the slowest shutter speed that you should have is 1/60th of a second. If it's 1/60th of a second or faster, typically we're not going to have to worry about moving the camera, or the person might be moving a little bit. Usually that's going to be good enough. We have image stabilization. I like 1/100th of a second or faster, but sometimes if you want to push the limit, 1/60th of a second for beginners is the max. If you are shooting a sporting event, I like to sneak a peek over here and make sure that this is at least 1/500th of a second. It really does depend on the sport. There are some, birds in flight, you're going to need 1/2000th of a second. In some cases, Just depends on what you're doing. Very, very fast subjects need a faster shutter speed, but to begin, 1/500th of a second. Why would I tell you that? The reason I tell you that is because as you use aperture priority, you're using your exposure compensation and we're bumping the control over, is that does affect the shutter speed. And so we have to keep a mindful eye on that. And a question I often get is, do professionals use aperture priority? My answer is absolutely, all the time, and it's completely okay. When I was a wedding photographer, I would shoot aperture priority because we'd be shooting in a dark chapel, and here comes the bride and groom, and I'm backing up and I'm shooting, and I don't want to have to worry about changing the shutter speed. I just want to, compose and make sure I don't trip. Take the shot. So when we go from that dark setting to the lobby, the camera changes the shutter speed for me. When we go from the lobby to the outdoors, the camera changes the shutter speed for me. I shoot sports on aperture priority mode. Why? Because sometimes clouds come in and I don't want to have to worry about changing my shutter speed. I would say I probably shoot aperture priority probably 80% of the time, 75 to 80% of the time. And the other mode that I use is manual. I use manual when I have enough time or when I am doing strobe shooting. So manual gives you complete control, but anything where I'm in a changing lighting condition, aperture priority mode, pretty much all the time. I want to take you a little bit deeper into exposure compensation and demonstrate what is happening here with this little guy on the bottom. In the lighting situation that I'm in right now, the camera is at f4, 1/160th of a second. Each of these numbers designates one full stop. One stop is twice the amount of light than the previous setting. So in the case of the diamond home plate to 1, when I go to 1, I am doubling the amount of light entering the camera. And I can prove this to you mathematically. Is that when we are at the diamond home plate, 1/160th of a second, and when we go to that +1, the shutter speed is now 1/80th of a second. So 1/160th plus 1/160th is 2/160ths, right? So we have two of those guys together. And when we add them together and simplify, we get 180. So we're taking twice the amount of shutter speed to make the image one stop brighter. The first time I figured this out, it was like my brain exploded. And this was like maybe a year and a half into my shooting career. Hadn't figured it out. I learned through trial and error. We didn't have YouTube when I started. Now, if we continue to go on this journey, look, 1/80th of a second, if I'm going to add twice the amount of light by the shutter speed, we can mathematically calculate this. 1/80th plus 1/80th is 2/80ths. Simplify, 1/40th. So when we get to 2, that should be 1/40th. There it is. And when we get to 3, it should be 1/20th. Not exact, it's in that ballpark, pretty close. In the opposite direction, if we want half as much light, then we would use a twice as fast shutter speed. So 1/60th times 2, it would be 1/320th of a second. There it is. So if we want twice as fast shutter speed, the next one should be 1/640. There it is. And if we're going down one more stop, it should be twice that, which is about 1250. There it is. And that is how exposure compensation is working. Let's talk about shutter priority mode. It's a mode I never use. Maybe once in a blue moon I'll use it, but I pretty much don't ever use it because I can do all these things in manual mode. I can dial in my shutter speed, my aperture. But the idea on shutter speed is the opposite of what it was on aperture priority mode. We select the shutter speed, and the camera is making adjustments to the aperture. So in some cases, if you want a specific shutter speed, and if the light situation changes, the camera is going to make those adjustments to the opening of the lens. In the case of exposure compensation, it works in a similar way in that it changes the aperture to make the stop adjustment. This is why I like to refer to this as the primary setting. The primary numero uno digit is changing the primary setting according to the mode. So if we're in TV, it's going to change the shutter speed. If we are in aperture priority mode, it is going to change the aperture primary setting. This is why I like to refer to these other guys as sometimes the secondary controllers. The way this is set up is the secondary setting is our exposure compensation. So primary, secondary, right? Come back into shutter priority. Now I'm going to throw you a curveball in that, let's say we're shooting sports and we need a fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second. Now the aperture is flashing. Camera's not happy. This is how cameras complain, is they start flashing apertures at you like this. Sometimes it'll be red, depends on the camera. And we're getting this exposure preview that, hey, this is pretty dark. If we know that we need a fast shutter speed and we've opened the lens as wide as it will go, what can we do to make the camera happy? Think about it for just a second. Now, if you said change your ISO, you are absolutely correct. We can come in and we can change our ISO. We're using this top thumb wheel until it becomes brighter and brighter. Then you notice it stops. We'll stop at 3200 ISO. Camera is no longer complaining. Camera's happy. So this is why we talk about how much light we're shooting and to be aware of it. There are a lot of indoor sporting situations where it's darker. You might need to bump your ISO up. So what is ISO? There's a lot of confusion about it, but think of ISO as an amplification to the light that hits the sensor. We're not necessarily making the sensor more sensitive, we're adding a boost. And there is some trade-off in this. I'm going to demonstrate it to you real quick. I'm going to take a picture of these blinds at 51,200. Take a look at this edge. And when we play that back and zoom in on the edge, you're going to notice that we get, it's almost this grainy salt and pepper. Not really pleasing to the eye, right? So let's do that again with a much lower ISO. I'm going to go all the way down to 400. It's not happy because of the shutter speed, but just for the demonstration of ISO, I'm going to change that real quick. Take a picture. And we're going to compare ISO 400 with ISO 51,200. When I zoom in on the edge, you can see a nice clean edge on the blind. There's that salt and pepper is gone. So what's happening is that the trade-off for ISO is that when we use very high ISOs, we get more grain. You're going to see this as a grain. It's not very pleasing. You can get away with it in some situations where people don't notice. And on Canon cameras, I mean, there was, when the 60 first came out, I was just amazed that I could shoot, at 6,400 and 12,800 and not really notice the ISO. So the short answer is that lower ISOs are going to have less grain, but you'll need more light. Higher ISOs, like 51,200, they're going to allow you to take images in lower light situations, but you're going to get more grain. If you're interested in what's going on with ISO noise, there is a video that I made called Shot Noise, and it will explain that the primary determinant is the light that you're shooting in. So sometimes people will shoot at ISO, 800 or even 400, and they're like, why is my image so grainy? Well, in situations where you have very low light, the photons, as they hit the sensor, are kind of scattered. That's the short answer, and it creates that noise. So a lot of this depends, again, on the light you're shooting in. Let's take a look at the program mode real quick. Program mode is not bad. I mean, I know of at least one famous pro photographer who shoots in program mode. It's just easier for him, and that's fine. Hey, he's amazing. So program mode, you'll notice that we don't have the options to change the shutter speed or the aperture. So if I tap the shutter button, what's happening on program mode is that we get different sets of information, different combinations. And the camera is basically saying, hey, if you use this shutter speed, you can use this aperture. And the reason we know that is because when we go in and we start really adjusting the exposure compensation, is we start to see changes in both numbers. So it's changing both of them. Program mode A lot of people don't know this, on Canon cameras is the handheld mode for flash, which means that when you put a strobe or a speed light on the camera, it is a great mode for shooting event photography. So, like a reception at a wedding or maybe a dark party where you want that strobe to fire. It is going to make sure that the shutter speed is at least 1/60th of a second and your pictures won't be all blurry. That is program mode. Let's talk real quick about manual mode. Manual mode, I think, is the easiest one to learn simply because it requires us to put in the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. We dial in everything. The camera is not doing any lifting for us. I use manual mode any chance I have enough time. So if I'm not worried about moving around or it's not an event, almost always on manual mode. If I'm in the studio using strobes, I am on manual mode. If I am shooting video, I use manual mode because it locks the camera settings and the exposure doesn't change. We just change our aperture, change our ISO, and nothing will change. When I take my hand and move it in front of the camera, nothing changes, right? So look what happened to the exposure compensation bar. We can't change it now. Can't even highlight it. Now it is moving when we rotate this set quick control dial on the back. And what's happening is the exposure compensation bar has become a light meter. It's basically still measuring light and it's telling us how bright or how dark the camera will be. If we take our hands and we put it over the lens, you can see that we can move that exposure compensation bar around. That does not happen in those other three modes. That's locked. It's going to be changing one of the other settings. And that's manual mode. Manual mode is amazing. While we are here in manual mode, I do want to talk about auto ISO. Auto ISO is something I do not recommend most of the time, especially if you are still learning, because it's going to make a lot of adjustments for you and you're not going to understand why the camera is doing it. Auto ISO is just like it sounds. The camera is going to be changing the ISO even in manual mode. There is a time and place for it, however. For example, indoor sports shooting. Let's say you're at an MMA event and you want to make sure your shutter speed is at 1/500th of a second and your aperture is at, let's say, f4.5. The problem with that kind of event, sometimes basketball, it just depends on the sport, is the lighting conditions can change by the lights themselves or how the athletes are moving. And when you get these flickers or pulses of light, if you're in manual mode, that's going to change the exposure of every shot. So what we do in those cases is we turn it to auto ISO, and as we push our shutter button halfway down, the camera is it's measuring the light, and it will determine the appropriate ISO for that one instant. So in those cases of indoor, arena type events where you have lots of light, maybe a disco, maybe a certain type of concert, lots of different kinds of lights coming on and off, auto ISO would be a great and powerful tool there. We can also change in the menu the limits of how far the ISO is going to go and things of that nature. I'll demonstrate that when we get into the menu section. Let's talk about bulb mode real quick. Bulb means that the shutter speed depends on how long we push or hold the shutter button down. So if I push the shutter button down and hold it down, the exposure starts. When I release it, the exposure ends, and obviously it's flooding the sensor with light and it's overexposed. So when you see this is referred to as overexposure. When it's pure black, it's underexposure, right? Bulb mode is very powerful when you use it with certain remotes. So you can lock the shutter button down if you're doing star trails at night and you need, very long exposures. Bulb mode is the way to go. Just depends on what you're doing. And then we have the C1, the C2, and the C3. Let's talk about the C1, the C2, and the C3. Those stand for custom. And the way this works is that we come into a mode that, let's say we're shooting portraits. And we have maybe very specific camera quality settings and focusing mode. We have eye detection turned on, and we want a certain picture style. We set the camera up the way we like it in that mode. Then we come into the menu, yellow tab, page 5, and we come to the custom shooting mode, and we can come to register settings. When I register at C1, the camera will remember those settings at position C1. Let's go ahead and do it. remembering them. And if I want to jump to those settings at any time, I would just come in and select my C1 aperture priority. See the mode change there. It's great if you do different styles of shooting. Let's say you're a portrait photographer, but you also do sports and landscape. Well, now you have a great starting point for each of those kinds of settings, and you wouldn't have to go and fumble with all these other little settings depending on the conditioner we're using, right? So that's C1, C2, and C3. Let's take a look at the flexible priority. So the flexible priority means is that when we come in, let's say we know we want a certain shutter speed. Let's say it's 1/500th of a second, right? Shooting the sports. So you'll notice that what will happen is the camera will now be responsible for the aperture and the ISO. So let's say we want the camera to handle the shutter speed. So we'll just turn that to auto. And we know we want an aperture of f8. We want a certain ISO. Well, now we've set this up to basically be aperture priority. It's the same thing. So flexible priority mode allows us to dictate to the camera which of the controls it is changing and which of the controls we are changing. And I know a lot of people who love it. So that is an overview of the stills mode and exposure control when we are shooting for still photography. When we come into the video modes, you'll notice that we have a lot of these different icons. I don't use the dummy mode for video. I don't use the program mode for video. The only two modes I ever use are really manual mode and aperture priority mode. When I am setting up my camera for video recording, there's some basics that I should just tell you is that if you're going for a film-like look, and many of you are, and it just looks better, in my opinion, is you want to double your frame rate to determine your shutter speed. So if I'm shooting at about 30 frames per second, I double that, 60, so I shoot at 1/60th. If I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, I want to double that, and I would shoot at 1/125th of a second, right? Now, a problem we will run into, you can kind of see it a little bit. Interesting, see it? You notice what's happening? Is that as we get into faster and faster shutter speeds, we start to have this great banding problem. Here's the problem. It's these little bands moving. You will see that when the camera is either in video mode or in electronic shutter mode, is that LED lights like this will create a banding problem. I'll demonstrate that in stills a little bit later. So the way you get around this for video lights is I recommend minimum 1/125th of a second. You won't notice it. Maybe in some cases 60. You can see it flickering as it change. But I actually made a video on why this happens. It explains it, goes into the physics of it. Set the shutter speed first. Then I set the aperture that I want to use. Say we'll go f4. And at that point, I would set the ISO. I don't shoot with auto ISO on video, but there are sometimes you want to do it. And that is a basic setup for video. We can start and stop video recording by pressing the red circle icon. At the time of this recording, there are some problems with the R5 overheating, and even that if you're shooting stills and then you go into video, that it starts to overheat as well. I'm kind of reserving my judgment on this because I'm hearing that Canon has some type of a fix or solution. But at the time of this recording, I believe the R5 is an incredible stills camera, amazing. It's not really a primary video shooter. I wouldn't call this an A camera. So if you're doing a lot of video shooting, this is not the camera I would recommend. I'm not ripping on the camera. It's just that the overheating interrupts shooting so much. However, as I get into the crash course and I demonstrate the different techniques, I am going to demonstrate all the techniques as if it were an A camera, simply to arm you with the knowledge of how to do these different kinds of shooting styles. In fact, I have a commercial that I'm shooting soon. I'm going to shoot a lot of it on the R5 just to get the 8K. I'm just curious. I just want to see how well it does. I want to have some options. Let me demonstrate real quick what an electronic shutter banding issue looks like. So if we were to come in to our menu, tab page 6, right here. Electronic first curtain basically means the sensor is exposed when you take the image, and a physical shutter ends the second part of the exposure and then it drops back down. Mechanical means that it's closed to start with and then it opens and closes. And this is where the problems happen, is the electronic continuous shooting. We do have the ability to shoot at 20 frames per second in this shutter mode. Here's the problem. Here's one of the problems, is that when we come in and we use a very fast shutter speed, is that we start to get banding. So when you see this happening, know your camera is not broken. It's merely that you're shooting with an electronic shutter in flickering lights like LEDs. Another drawback of electronic shutter is that if you are panning a fast moving subject with electronic shutter mode, you're going to start to see the jello effect. It is a warping or a distortion of the subject matter. And it's just a problem with the electronic shutter. Just wanted you to be aware of that in case you saw it. I'm going to come back in to our shutter mode. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be shooting on mechanical for the rest of the video. Let's change gears just a little bit. Let's talk about something a little bit, easier, and that is the topic of white balance. In the very beginning, AWB stands for auto white balance. For most pure beginners, that's going to be plenty. Just keep it on auto white balance for now. But what will happen is that as you are shooting, eventually you are going to get to a situation where all of your pictures have a certain color cast to it. Maybe it'll be a little bit blue, maybe it'll be a little bit yellow, and you'll be like, what is going on, right? So on the bottom of our auto white balance settings, we have a ton of different icons. In fact, this isn't really an easy place to see it. I just want to make this easy to see here. Let's do it from this screen. So coming into our auto white balance, let's see these guys a little bit better. It's giving us a preview, but the idea here is to match the icon with the light you are shooting in. We have a sun icon, and you'll notice the color is going to shift as I scroll through here. The human eye is amazing. It can adapt to the different temperatures or the different colors of light sources, and we don't even notice it. Camera sensors are different. Camera sensors have a much harder time adjusting to the type of a light source that they're shooting in. And so what's happening here is that when we pick the sun icon, we're telling the camera, hey, we're shooting in sunlight, and then the camera will change its color settings accordingly. So the short answer on this is to choose the icon of the light that you are shooting in. More important for things like JPEGs and video. Let's go through each of them real quick. We have our daylight or sunlight icon, shade, cloud cover. We have tungsten light, that's a light bulb. We have a fluorescent light, it's almost like a purplish kind of hue. We have our flash, we have custom white balance, and we have Kelvin white balance. When we're shooting JPEGs and videos, this is a little bit more critical because we don't have all of the color information like we do in RAW files. There are some important things I want to point out. If you come into the info on this screen, is that there are different kinds of auto white balance. So we have an ambient light priority, and then we have more of a white priority. Just preference in terms of what you want. I would just not even worry about this if you're a pure beginner. Intermediate shooters, you're going to start changing to your icons. When you get into the advanced shooting, you will custom white balance and use your Kelvin and things of that nature. So let's cover those real quick. What will eventually happen is you'll be in a shooting condition where you have mixed light. It may be a tungsten bulb and some fluorescent bulbs. And so the lighting is going to be a little bit weird. Or maybe you're shooting in shade, but there's also light bulbs inside the house. So it just depends on what you're doing. But the feature of custom white balance allows us to tell the camera what white is. So here's how custom white balance works. Take a picture of something white, pure white, come into your menu. So red tab, page 3, custom white balance. I'm going to select the image that I just took. I'm basically telling the camera, hey, this is white. I've done it with brides' dresses and walls and even a sheet of paper. We're gonna hit OK. Camera's telling us to change our white balance to the custom. We can do it right here in the menu. Come over. And now I have properly white balanced the camera for mixed lighting conditions because we're telling the camera this is what's white. There is another setting in here that I should briefly discuss, and that is the Kelvin setting. Kelvin gets into some of the deeper philosophies of use. Think of this as a rating for the type of light we are using. This is going to be easier to see what's happening When I'm in live view, I'm going to come into the Kelvin setting, the set button, and now we have the ability to change our Kelvin setting. There's a couple Kelvin settings you should know about. 5600 is traditionally what daylight Kelvin temperature is. Light bulbs, talking about tungsten and incandescent, 32 to 3300. And you will notice that the color is changing as I'm scrolling back and forth, but in the case of these daylight balanced lights that I'm shooting in, 5200 to 5600, I think the bulbs I'm shooting in right now are about 5100. You can see it's pretty much white. So what's happening is that when we select a lower Kelvin temperature, and you can see this blue light coming in, what's happening is the camera is adding blue to counteract the temperature of low Kelvin lights. I like to think of it in terms of things like candles. So if you light a candle is a very yellow light, right? So if we were shooting an all candle light, it would be a very yellow environment. And so setting the Kelvin temperature lower is adding blue into that situation to balance it out. If I was shooting at, let's say, twilight, the sun has just gone down and it's kind of a purplish, bluish kind of sky, that's a higher color temperature, higher Kelvin. And in those cases, what's happening is the camera is adding orange color to that situation to balance it out, to make it more white neutral. So there is some confusion in the terminology, is that when you take a picture and it has this golden hue to it, photographers will say that's a very warm color temperature. It's a very warm image. They're talking about a characteristic of the color. When you're talking about Kelvin, we're talking about a physically measurable numeric value when we're talking about temperatures in terms of being hotter or cooler, whereas higher Kelvin temperatures are literally hotter than cooler or lower Kelvin temperatures. So I just make that distinction. It's probably, maybe it's too much, but basically when we're talking about, images that are hot or cool, they're talking about the appearance of it, not so much the Kelvin temperature. I'm going to come back in and change this to auto white balance. So I want to come into the focusing lessons. We're going to talk about focusing in regards to still photography first. Then we'll go into the video focusing. I think focusing is really probably the second most important thing you should learn about your camera after exposure. It can be very confusing. We have 5,940 different focusing points, of which we can choose over 1,000 of them. We have different focusing clusters. We have different focusing modes, and there's different strategies depending on what you're shooting. I will demonstrate this in the crash course. The easiest way to learn this is to break these down into the how, the when, and the where. How, when, and where is all you need to worry about. And practice this as you're watching, because it'll start to make sense if you go through it. I think twice most people typically get it. So the first question is, how does the camera focus? Well, as I demonstrated, a halfway shutter button depression engages the camera's focusing systems if your lens switch is pointing to AF. If it's pointing to MF, you will push this down and nothing will happen. MF is manual focus. There are actually many different ways we can focus with the camera. Halfway shutter button depression. We also have the autofocus on button. This is back button focusing. Talking a little bit more about that later. The touch screen is amazing to focus by touching on the screen. It's incredible. And you'll notice that in each of these examples, we're given a green box. We're hearing a little beep. There's even this feature here, the touch shutter feature, that if it says touch shutter enable, and we touch on something on the screen, the camera will both focus and take the picture. Now there's a danger to that, in that if you're carrying the camera and you're bumping the screen, it's taking pictures of everything. So if you don't want that, see, I'm having a hard time hitting it. We can turn the touch shutter to disable, and by default, it just goes back to touch focus. So that is the short answer. How does the camera focus? The halfway shutter button depression or the AF on button, for starters, or touching on the screen. Next, we're going to talk about the camera's focusing modes. This is the when the camera is focusing. Now, there are different ways to get to the focusing modes. We can come into our Q button. You can see that we have it right here. AF operation, there are two of them. There's one shot and there's servo. I like that they've simplified this. One shot means that we push the shutter button halfway down, we can get focusing lock, and if we change the position of the camera, if we're recomposing, the camera's focus will not change. It'll stay locked. Pushing the shutter button down all the way takes the picture, of course. The heart of the matter with one shot is that when you get to that halfway shutter button depression, the camera stops focusing. It locks and it stays locked until you take the picture. So the other variant of this is servo. And you will notice that when we use the servo focusing mode, we get a blue box. It's different. You can see the blue box, and you'll notice that we don't get the beep. And when we use a halfway shutter button depression with servo, the camera is focusing over and over and over again. It's a continuous focus. It is constantly focusing. And that is the win. It's either one time or it's continuous. So you've probably figured out that if we are shooting still subjects that do not move, one shot is ideal, maybe a cooperating human. If we're dealing with subject matters that move, like a kid running around everywhere or athletes, and we want the camera updating focus, we want servo. And that's the main difference between the two, is if we're dealing with a still or a moving subject. So we've talked about the how, we've talked about the when. Now we're going to talk about the where. This deals with the camera's focusing clusters. They can be accessed by pressing the cluster button in the top right-hand corner. So when you see that box, just think, okay, that's the focusing cluster. When you select this on the bottom of the screen, we get a ton of different options. I am a big fan of a single square most of the time, but it changes depending on what I'm doing. And as you scroll through each of these, you'll notice the name changes and also the size of the focusing squares change depending on what we have. So let's talk about each of these individually. The first and probably the easiest one to understand is a single focus point. It's just a single box. It's very small. It's going to be very precise. We get incredible coverage with a single box in stills mode. It's really amazing. Very useful. But let's say we're shooting macro and we want to get a little bit more precise. Well, we would use spot AF, and you can see that it is much smaller. Well, let's say we need something a little bit bigger than a single box. We can go to the expanded area. So the way cameras focusing systems work is that they're usually looking for an area of contrast. If I have a pure white subject, in some cases, the camera might have a hard time focusing on it. But in this case, I have that right box on the cross there. Let's see if we can make it jump onto the, there it goes. It's kind of jumping over to the side because it sees, hey, there's something over there, right? Next, we have expand AF area around, just adds more boxes. And then we get to these cluster types that are zones. So a large zone, maybe if you're shooting something like a bird in flight and you want a larger area to look at, you can see that the boxes are looking for that area of contrast, right? And then we can go with large zone vertical, and we can change the position of that large zone from side to side, still finding that contrast. And then we have the horizontal. So in those first sets of focusing clusters, we are determining an area, and we're telling the camera, hey, look within this area for something to focus on. That said, there are some super powerful ones. I'm going to access it up here in the top corner. Is this guy right here. So face tracking with the ability to turn on eye detection. That's what it is. I'm going to put up another target. So as you can see, we have a handsome model who's going to help us with the face and eye detection. So coming back to this cluster, you can see a little smiley face and then a tracking square next to it. This particular cluster, what it means is it's going to be looking for a human face. And Canon has put a huge amount of work from everything that I'm seeing and other examples into detecting the faces of humans and animals. I've seen pictures of insect faces being locked on. It's really incredible because in the tests that I've done so far, it feels like this is more computer than it is camera. It's the first camera that I have felt like, oh my gosh, there's a lot going on in the background here. So face detection is wonderful for shooting portraits, people. And something we need to always remember when we're shooting portraits is that we want the eye to be in focus. It's been a problem. Sometimes it's a hassle when you're shooting with a very wide apertures, you get a very shallow depth of field. And so sometimes it's hard to get that eye detection just right. And so this is where the eye detection comes on. So when I press that info button, now I am in eye detection mode. So you can see that the camera is getting a really nice focusing lock. And we have these arrows pointing side to side, is that I can use the joystick. You can't really touch the screen to do it, but if you use the joystick, you can even determine which eye it is going to focus on. Canon has some incredible RF wide aperture lenses, 1.2, 2.0. They're just incredible. And when you get into those very shallow depths of field, you want your eyes to be in focus on your portraits. And in the past with DSLR cameras, what we would have to do is get a focusing square on the eye. And sometimes it wasn't precise enough. Or if we were trying to recompose, to change the composition, we would pull the camera out of focus. That is not required with eye detection. With eye detection, you can see how far it gets to the side of the frame. That is amazing. And for wedding photographers, people who are taking, pictures of people all day, this greatly speeds up the workflow. It reduces the number of steps. It makes those wedding photographers faster and more efficient, and fewer images are missing. So if you are doing paid work with eye detection on a camera, for portraits, it's amazing. It'll change your life if it is accurate. So that's the face detection. That's the eye detection. If we had multiple faces in here, as I'll demonstrate in the crash course, you'll be able to jump around to different faces and tell the camera which one to prioritize. When the face gets very, very small, at some point it will drop out and revert back to face detection. But there is another feature in this focusing cluster that is the tracking. So you can see that we have this little off switch here. And by touching on different parts of the blinds, I'm telling the camera to track that subject. So I'm telling it to ignore the human face and instead track the subject. And when I'm ready to focus, halfway shutter button depression, pushing it all the way will take the picture. The tracking on Canon's dual pixel autofocus squares in the past has been pretty good. It's pretty smooth, it's pretty accurate. It's even a little bit better now. So if there's a reason you want to track a moving subject, you can even try it with sports. So if you wanted, if you're doing sport shooting and you want tracking, I've had mixed results with this in the past. In terms of the tracking, I prefer an actual square where I know where it's going to take the picture. But it's just another option, another tool in the tool bag. And when I jump back to my face, I'm back in eye detection. If we are on square tracking and we want to turn it off, we just push right there. So we've talked about the how, we've talked about the when, and now we have talked about the where, the actual clusters. I like the dedicated button for it, so it just makes it easier to, select the square you want. I think the easiest way to get the focusing modes is the MFN button. It's right here. You just flip it over. So I like having those dedicated controls. So we've spent some good time on the autofocus. I want to show you some really cool tools for manual focusing. And to get into manual focus, I'm reaching over and I'm pushing the lens switch from AF to MF. The moment we do that, we get this little distance indicator where it's telling us how far away the camera is focusing from the focal plane of the sensor, right? In the past of film days, camera film days, movie film days, they would have to actually measure the distance from the camera to the subject in order to get things in focus. We're kind of spoiled now. We have all these great tools. So the first thing you get is this distance indicator. I think this works better when we can designate where the focusing square is. We can zoom in. I'm in autofocus mode, but if I flip back over to manual, I'm still on that same spot. I can zoom in even closer. And this is something that I refer to as manual zoom focus. It's super powerful for macro photography where you don't want the camera adjusting its focus. You want to get it locked down. I also do it for video. If I want a very specific place to focus on, I'll select an area, I'll zoom in, and I will get precise focus using the focusing ring on the lens. You'll notice we're at 15x magnification. Once I have it, I zoom out and then I continue shooting. That is referred to as manual zoom focusing. There is another fantastic tool that I want to demonstrate referred to as peaking focus. It's going to work great for manual focus. We come into our purple tab, page 2. The purple tab is mostly autofocus settings. We are going to select MF peaking and turn that to on, high, and red. What peaking is a red overlay. You can kind of see this faint red outline. And what's happening here is the monitor is putting this red pixelation over areas of contrast. And what it's basically saying is that the highest points of contrast is where it is the sharpest, because when I zoom out and I make it blurry, we lose that red overlay. Peaking focus is usually pretty accurate, but there are times and cases where you'll think you'll have it and you don't really have it. And so when you try to zoom in, we lose the peaking. We can get close and dial it in precisely. But peaking is, in my opinion, useful if you want a general idea where your depth of field is and you just want to see it and kind of get it in that ballpark. And that is our peaking settings. I'm going to turn this off. We also have these other colors in here, yellow and blue, if you prefer those. I'm going to turn the autofocus back on. There's a couple customizations I just want to point out real quick. As you become more advanced, sports photographers, a lot of them prefer back button focusing. It basically means the camera is not going to focus until they push this button. Now, it's already doing this. It's already set up for this. But in order to remove the autofocus from the shutter button, we have to customize it. So let me back out. We're going to come into our button customizations. We're going to customize the button. And so to get the classic back button focus and we want to remove the autofocus, you would come in here and select OK. At that point, pushing the halfway shutter button down will not engage focusing. It will only meter. For beginners and everybody else, I would say stay here for now until you get the hang of it. Because we're on the topic of focusing, there is something I want to talk about in the deep menu real quick, is just to mention it here, is the touch and drag autofocus settings. What this does is it turns your back monitor into a joystick. I don't believe this is necessary, but there may be some reasons, ergonomic reasons, that you may want to use your back screen. I am a left-eyed dominant shooter, which means I put my eye here and my nose is usually, bumps the screen. And so I don't like this because it moves the focusing squares around, when I'm looking through the viewfinder by using my nose. Right-eyed shooters, if their nose is over here, they don't seem to have as much of a problem with it. And there are a lot of people who love this. But when this feature is turned on, we have the ability to activate certain parts of the back monitor to become the new joystick, depending on your preference. You can put it top, bottom, left, right, wherever you want it, just depending on your needs, depending on what you're doing, you can turn the back monitor into a giant joystick, basically. We're going to keep it on whole panel. And there's different, basically, sensitivities in terms of how far you run your finger, how far do you want this focusing square to move. It's preference. So much of this is preference. It just comes down to who you are and what kind of shooting you're doing. Coming back out, real quick, I want to talk about some of the focusing tools in video. So we're going to jump into video. Now, the focusing modes that you select for video are going to depend on what you are doing and who you are publishing to and what you want them to see. For a lot of narrative work, it's all locked down. So you're manually focusing. The first AC is operating the focus control. He's making sure it's in focus where it should be. But with the release of the Canon 70D, I believe, it just changed everything in that we're able to just touch on the screen and change our focus from one point to another. So the Servo AF allows us to do this, is that by touching on certain subjects, we can rack the focus. We can move and change the focus very smoothly without interruption. And filmmakers do this to change the attention of the viewer. You see this all the time in Hollywood where you have somebody standing and there might be something on a table. You touch on the table and the focus goes to the table and the viewer sees it. It's a very common, popular technique in narrative film work. If we're doing, let's say, vlogging, for example, we may want to go with eye detection. If we're too far away, we may want to come in and go with face detection. So I'm pushing the info button instead of coming back to the screen. If we want a different eye, we can touch on it. If we don't want help from the servo, we would turn that off, and now we're in manual mode. So these are all important aspects of focusing to consider when we are focusing for movies. Let's talk about our metering modes real quick. Metering deals with how the camera is measuring light that's entering into the camera. The easiest way for me to teach this is to come into our metering modes and to select the spot metering mode. When we do this, you can see that we get this circle in the middle of the camera, and I'm going to take this light and turn it on and hold it in front of the camera. So I got this headlamp, right? What will happen is that as I move the light into the circle, you'll notice that the shutter speed changes to be very fast. When I move it outside of the circle, we get that normal even exposure. And in fact, as long as I hold that light outside of the circle, none of the exposure settings really change that much. It's when I move it into the circle, the camera gets darker. So what's happening here? What's happening is the camera is only measuring light from this circle in the spot metering mode. It's ignoring everything else. And that's what metering modes do, is they tell the camera to measure light from specific parts of the frame. Spot metering mode is great if you're shooting in like heavily backlit situations. You have all this light coming into the corners. Maybe you're taking a picture of a person and you're just telling the camera, hey, just measure light right from this one spot. And that's what the camera does. The most useful of the two are the spot metering mode and the evaluated metering mode, which breaks the frame up into different zones. Think of it that way, where it's giving more emphasis to different parts than others. And we can even control this more by using a partial metering mode and a center weighted average, where you're expanding how much of the data it's looking at. If we were to use the light again, we can kind of see that as we get to the further outside, it kind of ignores the light again. So if you're just getting started or intermediate shooter, I would say for now stick with evaluative. When you get into maybe shooting backlit portraits, things of that nature, you might want to start looking at the spot metering and some of these other settings. We're moving into the deep menu system. To get there, we're going to press the menu button, obviously. And Canon's menu systems for years, generally the consensus is they are the best, they're the most organized, well thought out. There is also a ton of information in here, and for the sake of time and simplicity, I'm going to take you through some of the settings and information that I think pretty much everybody has to know. If it's a feature in shooting, I will be covering that on the crash course where I'll take you through and I'll demonstrate how the feature works and how to get the most out of the camera, for example. The menu is broken up into color tabs at the top, and we can navigate by touching on those tabs, obviously. You can see that the color differences are very distinct. Red is for shooting. What you will also notice is that under each tab, we have these numbers, and those are individual pages. So if you want to navigate through the pages, you can use a joystick. You can touch. I try to use a corner of my finger. You can see that because the tabs and the pages are very close, sometimes you'll accidentally hit them. We also get this prompt over here on the far right that tells us a little bit about something that the page that we're on. So shooting page 8. There are many ways to navigate through the tabs and pages. For example, if you wanted to navigate through the page, we could use the primary selector. If we wanted to navigate through the tabs, we could use the top rear selector. If we wanted to navigate through the items themselves, we'd use the back scroll wheel. So red is for shooting. Purple is for auto focusing. Blue is for playback. The purple tab is for network, Wi-Fi, connectivity, things of that nature. The yellow wrench is the camera setup. Orange is our custom settings. Green is our My menu, which allows us to determine which features we want to appear on here. It's a little bit easier and faster to access if you only have a few items that you want in one location. Tab 1, page 1, image quality. This is how the files are going to be recorded to the memory card. This is specific for images. You will notice in the top right-hand corner, it gives you a symbol. of the type of compression for JPEGs and the size of the file. So in this case, 45 megapixels, it's giving us the resolution in terms of pixels wide and pixels tall. And then it's giving us the number of shots that we can take remaining on our memory card. If we didn't want JPEG, oh, and you can notice that we get these symbols here for the different control wheels. So if I wanted to go with RAW, I could select RAW. If I wanted no JPEG, I would turn it off. And you will notice that the moment I select RAW, we lose a lot of the space. And the reason is RAW files are much larger. There's all the color information. You can process RAW files far greater than JPEGs. JPEGs throw away about anywhere from 70 to 85% of the information, and you're limited in terms of how far you can edit them. We also have the CRAW, compact RAW, and you'll notice that we get an extra 1,500 or so images. It's a smaller size file that retains pretty much all of the color information. Think of CRAW as a more efficient type of RAW file without losing a lot of the color information as we would with JPEGs. So if I don't want any RAW, I would select it to this little dash, and then we come down to JPEGs, and you can all obviously touch on the monitor. You'll notice we have these different icons, a smooth edge L and a jagged L. That deals with compression, and compression basically has the processor or the computer of the camera makes the decision to throw away certain kinds of information. It's basically when 2 pixels are close enough in color, the camera just says, they're the same color. And when it does this for the entire image, it reduces the amount of file size. So, same file size, you'll notice up here in the top right, see the resolution is the same, but we can get far greater shots remaining on our memory card. And when I was a wedding photographer full time, this was, obviously something I was looking at because I'd go out and shoot 4,000 or 5,000 images. And so I studied this, I took pictures and I looked at them, and to the naked eye, this is very difficult to see. I couldn't see it even to the trained eye. And I came to the conclusion that for workflow reasons, jagged L was the way to go. Never had a customer complain about it, nothing like that. And I later learned that many other high-end wedding photographers also shot on jagged L. When we get into the medium size, you'll start to notice that we lose resolution, 22 megapixels, which is sufficient for an 8x10. There's a lot of things you can use a 22 megapixel image for. And some photographers, they're happy with that. But the advice that I give is shoot on L. If you're nervous about the compression, just shoot on smooth L. But shoot on L because you can always make the file smaller. You can make the image and the resolution smaller, no problem. It's a little bit harder to take it small and make it large. There is some great software available now that is doing this better than ever. But in my opinion, always better to shoot larger than you think you're going to need because you can always go down easily. 22 megapixels for medium, 12 megapixels for small 1. And then we have small 2, which is 3.8 megapixels. So, and this would be for something like, posting something on eBay. If that's all you do is, put images on eBay, then yeah, sure, it makes sense to shoot at S2. But most of us bought this camera for the full resolution, so I would recommend starting on L. Dual pixel RAW is a feature that we originally saw, if my memory serves me correctly, on the Canon 5D Mark IV. And it has to do with the dual pixel technology in Canon cameras that basically it allows you to take raw images that have 2 slightly different perspectives. We're talking about super minute. And the idea was that you could shift the focus a little bit, in post. And the truth of the matter is it didn't work that great. Obviously, this increases the file size. And for the amount of file size you're getting in the raw, it doesn't really justify doing this rate. You're just not getting a lot of benefits. So I just recommend, not using it. Cropping and aspect ratio, we talked about a little bit already, where we can crop out the area that we're shooting with. In some cases, if you're shooting for Instagram and you just want to see that square, this is where you can come in and do it. Pretty straightforward. If we want to have it masked or outlined, we can come in and determine that as well. So that's page 1. Exposure compensation, auto exposure bracketing. I'll be giving a demonstration of this on the crash course. There's our exposure compensation bracket. And if we remember, we can shift the exposure in one direction or another. But we have this new symbol down here where if we rotate the primary selector, we get a new set of features appearing. These little tick marks popping off on the sides. So what auto exposure bracketing means is that the camera will change the exposure settings between 3 shots. And in this case, it'll take one image that's 3 stops underexposed, one image that's at an even exposure, and one image at an overexposure of 3 stops. And the idea on this is that in some cases, you're in a high dynamic range area, you have lots of shadows and lots of highlights, and you want to capture all of the information, in one. You can't do it in one image. The camera is limited in terms of how much dynamic range it can capture in one image. So the way you get around that is you take different exposures. And this in the past is what we would do for high dynamic range images. We would take 3 pictures and we would put them together in Photoshop, and we could get these really crazy, amazing pictures, right? The cool thing about this is that we can shift the direction of that bracket. So we're getting at +6 or -6. And there are times and places that this is super powerful. If you're an indoor architecture photographer, let's say you're doing real estate images and you're taking pictures of the indoors, you're going to find out your windows are going to be overexposed, right? So you'll take an extra picture for the outside and blend those together in post. Oh, and it wants us to put it back to that to end it. Our ISO speed settings, a lot of this information is pretty straightforward. We can change our ISO setting here. We can increase the maximum range if you wanted to get the full range of the camera. You put it at 102,400. The auto ISO range we can also determine. If you didn't want the camera turning it up too high, we could turn it down a little bit. And then the minimum shutter speed that the camera is using with auto ISO we can determine. So auto, it's going to make the decision. When we come down to manual, we're going to tell the camera, hey, don't use a slower shutter speed than 1/125th of a second. So if you remember that example of the MMA, match, and you don't want the camera using slow shutter speeds, for example, in aperture priority, where it's making its own decisions, you would come in here and set this. This does not apply to manual mode, but if you're in the program or the aperture priority mode where the camera is choosing the shutter speed, it does apply. And hit OK. HDR PQ. PQ stands for perceptual quantization. This has to do with the input signal for displaying HDR images. And this is the first time I've seen it on a Canon camera. Beyond the scope of what a beginning or intermediate photographer would want to know about, suffice it to say, we can determine how the HDR images would be displayed, whether we want to give priority to midtones or highlights. This is the exact kind of thing that I would like to go into on the crash course. Auto Lighting Optimizer is a setting that basically gives JPEGs a contrast and a slight sharpness bump. Think of Auto Light Optimizer as applying a little bit of contrast, a little teeny bit of processing to your JPEG images. It's disabled in manual and bold modes. And it's something that, if you don't do a lot of processing, you might want to have it done automatically in the camera. This is where you set the level of that from low, standard, or high. Highlight tone priority gives the camera permission to make a very slight shift in highlights to capture the detail in those highlights. I almost never use it. Let's say you have a lot of reflections in your shot with lots of detail being lost and you don't want to deal with it in post. This is where you would come in and turn it on to enable or enhanced. It's not something I really use. Anti-flicker shooting. We talked a little bit about this. This is where we can disable it in the menu. External speedlight control. I have a full course on the Canon Speedlight 600EX RT in the ST E3 transmitter. And I go into pretty much everything you want to know about those systems. This feature allows us to control many things about speedlights from the camera. And as a general rule of thumb, I control speedlights from the speedlights. It's just a lot easier. You can change some things in the menu, but if you forget about it and it starts getting a little bit confusing. So I always recommend changing it from the flash. This allows us to control certain settings about the flash from the camera. But because we don't have a built-in flash, it's not really something I really use that much. I always do it through the speedlight or the transmitter itself. Godox makes a pretty good speed light for about $110. It's the TT685C. I have not tested that out on the R5 because I have speed lights, right? But in the past, it works great with Canon cameras. White balance we talked about. This is the menu location to choose our white balance settings. We talked about custom white balance. If we take a picture of something white, we would come in and hit set and then change our white balance to custom. White balance shift and bracket. This is something that on Canon cameras I've never used. I have used it on other camera systems. I don't know why, but Canon colors, they just look great to me. They always look accurate if my white balance is set up correctly, and I've never had to shift it. What this does is it allows you to change how your white balance appears. So if you think you got it set up and it's like a little bit reddish, you would go in the opposite direction. And this is something that, again, beginning and intermediate photographers or videographers don't even worry about it for now. But if you want to fine tune your white balance, this is how you would do it. The colors obviously are green, red, amber, magenta, and blue. And so we can shift between those four colors. You can also shift it up, and it gives us some information about what we've changed. But again, this is something I've never used on any Canon camera ever. Color space. Most of us are using sRGB. If you are shooting for a magazine and you need Adobe RGB, you would come in here and select Adobe RGB. Picture style. These are the recipes that the camera is using to create JPEGs. That's how I like to think of them. And you will notice that we have these 6 variables on the top. To see what those variables are, we're going to come into the detail set, and we can see that the first 3 deal with sharpness in terms of the strength of the sharpness, the fineness of the sharpness, and the threshold of the sharpness. Then we have contrast, saturation, and color tone. In the beginning, for beginning and intermediate photographers, I would say don't even worry about these. The idea behind them is that you can get slightly different color schemes depending on what you're shooting. For example, if you are shooting portraits, you can get more accurate flesh tones when you use the portrait picture style. If you're shooting landscapes, you get more vivid blues and greens shooting landscape. If you're shooting something that requires fine detail, you can get better sharpness using fine detail, and so on. So you get the idea. Monochrome is black and white. And then we also have these user-defined picture styles. So we can come in here and tweak to our heart's content. But if you're still learning the camera, I would say don't worry about this until you got a grasp of exposure and focusing and some of those other features. And then you can come in here and tweak this. Very popular among videographers to come in to picture styles and to create custom user-defined picture styles where they're turning down their sharpness, and they're turning down their contrast, and they're turning down their color because they want to process and add those and tweak them in post. It's sort of like a slight workaround for not having, raw video, which we have. We have 8K raw video, but keep that in mind. This is applying to JPEGs. Video is a form of JPEG, and it allows the operator to tweak the output of those JPEG images. Clarity has to do with the edge sharpness of our subject matter. And if you wanted to increase the clarity, you could bump it up or you could turn it down. It's also something you can do in post. If you notice that your JPEGs lack clarity, you can experiment with it. Beginners, I would say, don't worry about this. Lens aberration correction. There's actually a lot of good information in here. And the way it works is that camera manufacturers, in this case Canon, make their lenses identifiable when they connect to the camera. So when we put our 24-105 on our R5, the R5 recognizes it specifically as that lens. Lenses have defects in them that we never see. For example, vignetting, so darkening in the corners. And sometimes you'll see it on wide angle lenses. You'll see it just a little bit. But what happens is camera manufacturers put software into their cameras to clean up the lens defects, to make the lenses appear like they're working better than they really are. And for most part, we don't even notice it. Okay, so there's lots of different kinds of correction going on. Peripheral illumination correction is vignetting, cleans it up. We have distortion correction. So if we're shooting wide and we get that pin cushion look where things are kind of stretched out, we could turn this on and it would correct it. The digital lens optimizer cleans up a number of other defects, including chromatic aberration, which is a color fringing we see on edges. There should also be things like diffraction, where we lose sharpness as we increase our f-stop. Suffice it to say, these are custom profiles that make the lenses work better. Now, when we connect lenses from other manufacturers that are not recognized by the system, for example, third-party lenses, then we lose those benefits. And so sometimes I get the question, is it better to use Canon lenses on Canon bodies? Most of the time, if cost isn't a problem, yeah, it is, because you get these lens profiles in the cameras cleaning it up. And this becomes more important for videographers, because videographers, a lot of the times they're shooting in JPEG and they want to try to get it right in camera. And it's kind of hard to clean up vignetting, on a JPEG video file. Probably too much information, but suffice it to say, there's a lot of good stuff in here. Canon's RF lenses are incredible. I think they're the best. I know a lot of people are going to not like me saying that, but collectively, it's probably the best lens lineup in the world. Just one man's opinion. Long exposure noise reduction deals with images over 1 second. And when we're dealing with 1 second exposures, typically we're also shooting in low light situations, which gives us this grainy variation because of shot noise. There's a video I made on it. Suffice it to say, this helps clean this up. If you're shooting long exposures, turn it on to auto. The camera will kick it on automatically after you get over that 1 second, or you can just turn it on. When you're using a long exposure noise reduction, the processing takes a little bit longer. Keep that in mind. High ISO noise reduction is something I recommend leaving on standard. So as you bump your ISO up, the camera can clean up a lot of that grain and noise. In some cases, it'll do it by trying to blend or smooth it. And so sometimes you'll see this almost like a softness appearing. But standard in the past has worked fantastic for me, and it's typically where I leave it on Canon cameras. Dust delete data. On the crash course, I will teach you how to clean your sensor. There's a couple different tools that I use that make it pretty easy to see the dust. If you don't have those tools, it's pretty nerve-wracking because you don't really know what you're cleaning. But I will demonstrate this on the crash course. The dust delete data basically is a software cleanup where you have a spec on 1,000 images, and this allows you to clean up that dust with software. It actually happened to me once on a wedding. I just missed a sensor spec, and it was on every image, and we had to go in and post and clean it up. It was not fun, but I didn't even do it from the camera. I did it manually using Photoshop and some automations. My advice on this is that if you have a really important shoot, check your sensor for sensor dust. All you need to do is to take a picture of a cloud at f/22, inspect the image, and if you have it, you'll see these little specks. And in some cases, you might have to go in there and clean it, but clean it up before the important shoot. Multiple exposure mode is pretty cool. It's a little gimmicky, but there is an application that looks great, and I will demonstrate this on the crash course, as I will with HDR mode. If you don't have time for auto exposure bracketing and you're shooting that sunset, HDR mode is the way to go. You have a bunch of different options in here, including turning it on to different exposure levels. We have different processing effects. Do you want it for one shot or every shot? Auto align, yes. Save the source images, yes. It's a pretty cool feature. Focus bracketing is another lesson I'll demonstrate on the crash course. It allows us to program the focus of the camera to change between each shot up to 100 shots. The reason why this is important is if you're doing close-up or macro photography, is you want to maximize your depth of field, and you also want to maximize your sharpness. And if you start using f-stops that are very small, you lose sharpness. You get more depth of field, but you lose sharpness. And so the way macro photographers get around this is they take multiple images, changing the focusing point, and then stacking them together. And this is the way to do it. If you're doing macro, focus stacking is the way to go. It's a really cool, fun feature. The interval timer allows us to program the camera to take images at certain intervals. So we would come in here, we'd hit enable, come into the detail set. We would choose the interval between each shot and the total number of shots, and then the camera would automatically take these pictures. In the past, you had to buy something called an intervalometer that would program the camera. You plug it in to the port, and that's how you do it. Now we have it built into most modern cameras. I will demonstrate this on the crash course as well with a sunset. We have the ability to use a bulb timer, and we'd have to be in bulb mode to see it. So we're going to go into bulb mode, turn it on, come into the info set, and this is going to program the camera to take the bulb exposure so we don't have to keep our finger pressed on the shutter button the whole time. And hit OK. 3 seconds, right? See, my finger is not on it. Really nice if you do a lot of bulb exposures. So this is basically a built-in bulb remote, so you don't have to hold the shutter button down or use an external remote. Very nice. Shutter mode we've talked about. Right now I am on mechanical. That means I have a physical curtain for the first part of the exposure. Sensor's covered. First curtain drops down. We take the picture. Second curtain drops down to end it, and then it resets. Electronic first curtain is when the sensor is exposed already. We take the shot, starts, and when it ends, a mechanical shutter comes up, ends the exposure, and resets. And the electronic shutter is that we do not use either of those. It's just an electronic shutter, and we've talked about some of the artifacts with those already. Release shutter without card is just like it sounds. Do you want to be able to take pictures without a memory card in there? Ultimately, it's going to tell you if you don't have a memory card in there, so it's not a big deal. But I do remember getting an email from a couple who had a camera that they were convinced there was an internal memory, and there wasn't. Took it on their vacation. Touch shutter, I usually leave it turned off because I bump the monitor. Image review has to do with the automatic playback of the images. So when you're shooting, do you want the images to be displayed? If so, how long? We can turn that off. If we're doing sports shooting, we don't want to mess with it. We can also review through the viewfinder. Pretty cool. High-speed display, you'll notice, is turned off in this situation. And so you might be wondering, how do you turn it on? It wants a couple things from us. First, it wants us to be in servo. Should change that. It also wants us to be on high speed continuous in the case of a mechanical shutter. So this is why it was grayed out. Now we have it. What this feature does is that when we're using a high speed burst for sports, for example, it is going to allow us to track that moving subject with greater accuracy instead of dealing with, playing images back or slowing down. There are a couple times it won't work. So if you're not in servo mode, for example, or if you are using a long shutter speed, longer than 1/30th of a second, or an f-stop greater than f11, this will not be working. You won't have access to it. If you do a lot of sports shooting, you're probably going to be using it. And another part of this is that when we use electronic shutter curtains, this is automatically turned on. So this is a great option if you're a sports shooter and you want to have that ability to track the images a little bit smoother between shots. You would come in here and try that out. The metering timer deals with how long the aperture or the shutter speed is being displayed. So if we're getting our camera set up, do you want those numbers to turn off at a certain time? And if so, we can determine that time exactly. Exposure simulation, very important for beginners because it allows you to preview how bright or dark your images will be. The one time I turn this off is when I am shooting strobes. And the reason is strobes introduce different kinds of lights while as we're shooting. It doesn't really give us an accurate preview anyway. And sometimes studios are dark. And so when you turn off exposure simulation, the camera will basically get the monitor of your subject bright enough so you can focus. It's not previewing the shot. It just allows you to see where things are and get your focus points lined up. And then when you fire the strobe and you're adding this light, you would review the image and adjust accordingly. But every other example that in terms of my shooting, it's turned on enable. I get a lot of emails from students asking why they're not getting a preview. It's this feature right here on page 7. Shooting information display allows us to determine different kinds of information appearing as we are shooting in live view. So if we come into our screen info settings, you can see we get these different check marks, right? For those screens we were scrolling through. If we didn't want all those screens, we could uncheck that screen and it would not appear as we toggle our info button. Something else we can do is we can come into each of these screens and determine which information is appearing, general information is appearing on this particular screen as well. So lots of customization. We also have settings for our viewfinder vertical display, our grid display, histogram, and a focusing distance. Remember when I hit that manual focus, we got that little grid that popped up. We can change those units to meters or feet. Very nice. Finally, page 8, we have our viewfinder display format. If you wanted to determine how your electronic viewfinder was showing information, we could change it. Our display performance, do you want it to be super smooth? It's going to take up more battery life, or do you want to do power saving? Those two options. And that is the red tab, that's shooting. This bright purple tab deals with all things autofocus. We can choose the focusing mode, auto servo or one shot, the method, if we're talking about the clusters, the subject to detect. This deals with the face detection. So if we're dealing with people, animals, or no priority, very nice. We'll keep with people. Eye detection, I think, is something easier determined as we're shooting with that little eye icon that we demonstrated. Continuous autofocus is a feature that tells the camera to essentially pre-focus before you push the shutter button halfway down, so the camera's constantly focusing. I recommend leaving it turned off. And we also already talked about the touch and drag settings, using the back monitor to essentially be our new focus point director. I don't use it because we have a joystick, but we talked about that in the focusing lesson. Manual peaking settings we've talked about. This gives us an overlay to see about where the camera is focusing. The Focus Assist Guide is a focusing tool for manual focusing. If you're not in manual focus, you won't see it. We're going to turn this on and tap the shutter button. Now I'm going to flip to manual focus, and this is the tool right here. In the past, we would normally see this on certain cinema cameras for Canon. And you notice that we have a box with a tick mark straight up and these tick marks on the side. It's out of focus. The idea on this is that as we rotate our focus ring, we get these tick marks and they're starting to come together. And when they point to that top tick mark, they turn green. It's a focusing tool that tells us when we are manually dialed in. I don't use it a whole lot. I'm using the joystick to move it around a little bit. And it's looking for these areas of contrast again. It's another tool in the toolbox. I think the manual zoom focusing is a little bit more accurate because I know what I'm getting, but that's what it does. Auto focus assist beam firing deals with Canon speed lights. There's a little infrared focus assist beam that turns on and helps determine the distance. And I would just recommend leaving this turned on, because in the past, I've had students turn it off and not really know, and we had to go through the menus and find out what was happening and why their speed light was missing so much. The short answer on this is just leave it turned on for now. Page 3 in the focusing tab allows us to determine different types of servo autofocus. So when we go from one shot to servo, we have the ability to change how our servo is behaving, where we can determine the tracking sensitivity of a moving subject, as well as if it's accelerating or decelerating. This is going to depend largely on the type of sport or motion that you're shooting. It tries to give you, some of the information in the beginning. Stick with servo 1, but as you become a specialist, or if you're already familiar with the types of sports and the motions that you're shooting, you would come in here and tweak this to taste. Again, I would say this is for more advanced expert type shooters. Coming into page 4 on the purple tab, there's a couple of things in here that you will want to know about. Lens electronic manual focus by default is turned off. If you turn this to on, essentially what it allows us to do is, if we are in one shot and we get a focus and holding the shutter button down, we decide to rotate the manual focus ring, is that we can tweak it just a little bit. Probably not something a beginner would need to know about, but it's there if you need it. The other options down here that I think are worthwhile are limiting which clusters are available. If you didn't want all 8 of those clusters available, as you're selecting your cluster squares, you could turn these off. You'll notice that we can't turn off a single square. Another pretty useful tool is the orientation linked autofocus point. This is something that I'd probably recommend turning on. And what it does is it tells the camera to remember the focusing square based on its last orientation. So let's say you're shooting some type of subject and you have it composed in a very specific way for horizontal orientation versus vertical, and those focusing points are changing. So as you're changing the camera back and forth, this feature makes it so you don't have to rechange your focusing square every time you move the camera into that vertical or horizontal orientation. Autofocus selection control, this deals with selecting the clusters, and the way it's set up right now is that we push the cluster button and we can toggle with the MFN button. If you wanted to, use maybe that primary selector wheel, you would choose this. The rest of this stuff I would probably not really worry about right now. We have the prioritization in one shot. Do you want it to get focus lock, or do you want it to make sure it takes the picture? We have switching for tracked subjects. What happens when the lens doesn't find autofocus? We can tell it to stop searching. And then finally, we are on page 5 of the purple tab. Initial autofocus point for face detection and tracking. By default, auto is fine, but it also allows us to determine if we wanted to start with a particular cluster. We have which direction the focus ring is changing focus. This is very specific if you have a particular preference. We can also determine the sensitivity of our manual focusing ring, whether it's determined by the speed or the degree, how far we're rotating it. And then we also have our joystick sensitivity for autofocus point. Do you want to make it more or less sensitive? These are all preference settings for how we're operating the focusing of the camera. That's our purple tab. Coming into the playback, a lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward. It has to deal with, like it sounds, how we play our images back. We can protect our images by selecting individual images, and when we push the set button, we get a key icon. This will prevent us from accidentally deleting it in camera. However, it does not protect when we format our memory cards. It's something to keep in mind. I almost never protect my images simply because I don't really delete in camera unless I know it's a terrible image. We can select a range or all the images in a folder. We can unprotect everything. We can protect everything on the card or unprotect everything on the card. I don't really erase a lot of images in camera because there have been many times where I've thought I've taken a bad shot and I look at it on my computer and it turns out to be fine. In some cases, like one of my favorite shots. So I usually don't delete on camera a whole lot, but we can select and erase images by a range, all the images in a folder, or all the images on the card. The probably most useful time to do this is if you have a memory card and you're running out of space and you're still on a shoot and you're like, oh man, I wish I had another 100 shots I could take. Then you might want to do it. That has happened to me. So just something to know. Rotating the stills, if we want to rotate it in camera, we'd come in here and press the set button. And I'm obviously rotating this. It's better just to have the camera do it automatically. Change movie rotate information allows us to determine how this will be displayed on smartphones. So if right now, the top on a smartphone is here, but now the top is over here. You can see this little triangle determining. So if you were shooting for, let's say, something you're going to post on Instagram or, some sort of vertical video file, this allows us to determine which of those sides will be up before you import it to your smartphone. I'll leave it there. Rating, we can rate in the deep menu. We have the rate button right here. The way it works is we come in and we determine the star rating. You can see as I move the scroll wheel over, I've given this a 5-star rating. So when I import rated images into Lightroom or Camera Raw, these ratings are remembered. And so if you got an awesome shot, and you have hundreds of images, you can just rate it and mark it. So when you pull it in, you can easily access it and find where the image is. We can do the rating by range, all the images in a folder, or all the images in a card. Image copy allows us to move images from one card to another. My CF Express card isn't here yet. It should be here in a couple days. I'll demonstrate how to do this on the crash course. Pretty straightforward. I don't use the camera to print images. And the reason is I spent a lot of money on this camera and I like taking my memory card out in downloading the images and looking at them or putting them into the printer themselves, but there is a way that we can connect our camera to a computer and we can determine the print order. So if we have no other way of connecting to a printer or a computer, this is how you could print straight from the camera. Photo book setup, I've never used it. It allows us to select images and basically put together a little photo book in camera. Raw processing allows us to take our raw images and convert them into JPEGs. So we would come in, we would select the image, okay, and then we can also go to the high efficiency format. Let's just say JPEG, for example, just to see these features. And over on the right, you can see we can adjust our brightness, the white balance. It's a mini RAW converter built in camera. The ISO, image quality, and we can actually save this to a JPEG, save it as a new file, and then we would have access to that converted RAW file without needing to put it onto a computer. I do almost all my processing on a computer, and it's asking, am I done processing? Yep, I'm done, and it kicks me out. We can also apply it to a range of images if we wanted to. Dual pixel RAW processing deals with changing the dual pixel RAW feature. Again, I don't really think it's something worth doing. I don't think it's even worth the time or the effort, but it's there if you need it. We can resize our images if we wanted to, depending on the resolution, medium to small, small 2. We can crop images. So using the rear thumb wheel on the top, we can determine the crop of it. If we wanted to tilt it in a direction, one direction or another. So you can see that, kind of hard to see, but you can see the edges changing, that I am cropping it in a direction. We can change the aspect ratio of the crop. We can save it or we can exit. So we have the ability to crop images in camera. So the high efficiency image format is something that if we take, let's say, HDR PQ images, that those are going to be high files. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. But if you want to convert those files into JPEGs, this is where we could do it. Slideshow allows us to basically turn the camera into a slideshow. We take an HDMI cable, we plug it into a monitor or TV. We used to do this at weddings, and we would come in here and we would hit start, and we can determine how long each of the images are showing, for example, 3 seconds to loop it. We don't have a lot of control over which images we're showing, but suffice it to say, this allows us to play images on a monitor. It was a great fun thing to do right after a ceremony at a wedding reception. Set image search conditions is that when we're searching for images, do we want to do it by the star rating? Do we want to do it by the time, the folder, the protected files, what type of file we have, whether it's a video or a still? So lots of ways to search through. Approximate magnification, this guy. So when we use the magnifying glass for playing back an image, how much do you want to zoom in? The initial one. There's 2x, and if I want to zoom in, I can rotate the rear thumb wheel. Pretty straightforward. When we play back images, if we rotate the primary selector, you can see that we can jump through a certain number of images at a time, and we can control that in this setting. Do you want it to be 1 image, 10 images? Do you want it to be a specified number of images, in this case 30? Do you want to jump by date, by folder, movies only, stills only, protected or rated? So we can control how we jump through our images. I'll be honest with you, like if I'm really searching for something, what I'll do is I'll play the image and I'll start doing this. And you can just keep on pushing it until you have, it looks like hundreds of them, and then I just use the the scroll bar over here. We can touch and drag through the settings and find the image. That's usually how I really do it. But we have this option. Switch these two controls is basically saying when we're playing back images, we can image jump or magnify, and if you want to flip those based on this top thumb button in the primary selector, we can do so by hitting enable. See how it switches them? Leave it on disable. The rate button. this determines how this guy works right here when we're playing back images. So the idea on this is that if you tap the button, if you push it once and release, it will do the item on the left. If you push and hold, it will perform the function on the right. By default, it is the rate button and the microphone record button. So let me demonstrate this real quick. Is that when I'm playing an image back, we could press the rate button. Just pushing it will change those stars, right? However, if we push and hold it, you can say testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2, and you can see that we get up to 30 seconds of record time on the image file. So if it was a great shot, I would say, hey, this is an amazing shot, right? And then we'd release it. So this allows us to embed audio information into our files. We've seen this on higher end Canon cameras for a long time. Coming back in to the rate button, we can determine how these operations work. And if we want to play that back using the rate button, we would choose push for playback, hold to record. And if I hit play, so the idea on that is that we have the ability to play it back if you want. So this menu item allows you to determine how you are using this button. I kind of like the playback if I want to play a note, but if you want both the rate and the microphone, you're going to have to go with this. I think there should be one that would also allow you to play back, but I don't see it in here. We also have the ability to use it to protect or erase images, but I think the most two useful ones are those two. Memo audio quality. If we don't really care about the quality, we can record at a lower quality if we wanted to. And that brings us to page 5, playback information display. So when we're playing the images in playback, what is some of the data you want to see? So when we hit play and I start toggling info, you can see with the number of shots we've taken, battery life. You can see that we have the audio file embedded here. We have our EXIF data in terms of our exposure settings. If we continue to toggle, you can see that we get the scroll wheel here. We can go up or down, see all kinds of information about the file, just depending on what you want to see. And if I continue to press info, I'm brought back to this play again. So this is asking which of those screens you want to see, and you can turn them off if you really didn't want to see them or not. Highlight alert allows us to see, it's like a flashing, see, I'm sure I have one in here somewhere, overexposure. Is that it? There it is. So now it's flashing. Anything that is overexposed will flash. This is a pure overexposed shot. It was the bulb shot I did. And so this is useful if you want to know what parts of your image are overexposed. Like if you overexposed your sky, it would be blinking on the sky. Autofocus point display tells us where our focus square was when we took the picture. That is very different than where the camera was focusing, because if you remember, we can recompose. We can get a focusing lock, and holding that shutter button halfway down, if we change the position, well, now the focal plane isn't where the focus square was. So this just tells us the square that was used. Playback grid, if we want an overlay on the image that we're playing back, tic-tac-toe grid, 6x4, or tic-tac-toe with diagonals, we can do that. There it is. The movie play count, you can play it by the record time or the time code. And then we have our HDMI, HDR output. So if we are exporting to a recorder like the Ninja 5, I'll demonstrate the setup on the crash course. But if you're outputting HDMI, HDR, you would want this turned on. That's the blue tab. I hope I have enough time to show you how to connect with your smartphone through Wi-Fi to remote control the camera. You can also download images to your smartphone. It's really great. We also have a 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi connectivity from the camera, which will allow us to automate images downloading directly to a cloud service or even our computer. Obviously, beyond the scope of this video, if I do a video on that automatic download, I will put that link in the description, or maybe somebody else will do a good one and I'll put that link in there. Just know that this is really revolutionizing our workflow, where we can set our camera up to download images without taking the memory card out of the camera. But hopefully we'll have some time at the end of this menu section to cover the Wi-Fi stuff. I know I'm trying to hurry now because I know the lesson's getting long. Yellow tab allows us to control the camera settings. Record function card folder selection. This deals with when we have multiple cards in the camera, how do we want to manage our stills versus our video? So we can see that the stills option is designated with the camera silhouette, and the video recording option is designated with like a film camera. So the idea on this is it's asking, do you want to keep your photos and your videos separate? So when we turn this on, what will happen is our video files would go to our CF Express card and our still images would go to our SD card. When we come to the record options for stills only, we have some other features. Standard is it's just recording to a memory card, and auto switch card means when you fill up, it's going to automatically switch to the other card. We can record JPEG and RAW files into separate cards, or we can record images to both cards at the same time. This is very popular for professional photographers who want backups. The video record options are a little bit different in that we can also switch to memory cards once the first card fills up, and we can also determine that our RAW video files would go to our CF Express card and our MP4 video files would go to our SD card. The record and play option basically means is that right now, when we are shooting and playing, we're going from the number 2 card. For video, when we're shooting and playing, also we're going from the number 2 card. If I had my the CF Express card in there, we would have different options. Finally, we have the ability to choose the folder that we're shooting in, or we can create a brand new folder and change the folder name. We could come in here and type what we wanted, for example. Really powerful if you're doing multiple shoots in a day and you want to keep things separate. For now, I'm just going to leave it on this, hit OK, come back out. File numbering deals with the numbering of the files themselves as we are recording the images to the memory cards. Continuous means is that it's going to keep on continuing. Even if you switch the memory card, it's going to pick up where it left off. Auto reset sets it back to 0001. We can also hit a manual reset that will set it to 0001 whenever we do that. Just leave it there for now. The file name deals with the 4 sets of letters in front of the files. When we come into file name, we have a default, and we also have these 2 custers, Michael, Andrew, the Maven is what that stands for. And we can also add the image size if we want. So we have a default setting, default name, and we also have a user setting. So if I wanted to change this to be Michael Andrew Photography, for example, hit OK. Then all of those images would be Michael Andrew Photographer. If we wanted to go into this plus the image size, we could do that as well. It basically gives us some options to choose how our file names are set up. We can format the memory card. I would definitely recommend making sure you have at least 2 backups before you format your memory card. There's a workflow and a process to it. Typically, I come home, start uploading files, start charging my batteries from the shoot while those are uploading, and then I create a duplicate online. There's a number of different ways you can do this. I usually have 2 hard drives that have it, plus the cloud version of it that my assistant has. So we try to keep a copy in separate places. But format your memory card will erase everything from scratch, and you should be doing it regularly after you have at least 2 copies. Auto rotate, I recommend leaving here. This will rotate your portrait orientation images for cameras and computers. We can add the rotate information for videos. I think I demonstrated that in the blue section. In order to add it, when we take it out of the camera, we'd have to enable this. And then we have our date and time set up. Second page deals with the language. Canon has a ton of different languages in here. This will, if you have a native language that isn't English, it'll allow you to read it in your native language. NTSC, for those of us in the United States, if you're on the PAL system shooting at 25 frames per second, you would choose PAL. The help text, basically choose how large that text is. We have our beep. So if we don't want to hear the beep when we're touching the screen or at all, we could just come in and turn it off. Headphone volume, we saw this in the overlay of the video section, but we can also change it here. Power saving, is I've set this up so I can teach without the camera turning off. But if you want to save, your battery power, you can have the camera display turn off after a minute or auto power off completely after 30 seconds. Just depends on your preference. The eco mode is a battery saving feature that will essentially turn the camera into a more dim screen if this is turned on. So when you're shooting, it's brighter, but when you stop shooting, it becomes dim. I have it turned off for now. We talked about the screen and the viewfinder display options. It's basically telling us how we want the EVF, the auto switch in the screens to work. If I'm shooting on a gimbal, I'll come down and just leave it on screen all the time. There may be some cases where you only want the EVF to work. Otherwise, I have it set to auto 2. Screen brightness is just like it sounds. It allows us to brighten the image. If you're outdoors shooting and you want to see it a little bit easier, you can come in here and turn this up. The viewfinder brightness is the same thing, but it has to be done while you're looking through here. You can't really see it on the back monitor. Hit OK. We can even shift the color tone if you think should be a more blue or a more yellow type of look. We can fine tune basically the color balance of the EVF if we wanted to. User interface magnification, kind of a cool accessibility feature. It's when you double tap the menu screen. If this is turned on, you'll be able to see closer. There it is. So it allows us to see things a little bit easier. Page 4, HDMI resolution. So when we're feeding a signal out to that Ninja 5 recorder, what is the resolution going out of that cable? So we can have it set to auto or 1080, just depends. The touch control, we can make it standard, sensitive, or turn it off completely. I think the touch control on the monitor is amazing, so standard for now. The multifunction lock, that's the lock button up here. The one I mentioned, you want to be a little bit careful about bumping it. If you bump it a lot, you might want to come in here and just turn them all off. Just saying. Otherwise, that lock control, when it is activated, it is going to prevent us from bumping the camera in changing those settings. So if I activate the lock button, it's telling me which controls are locked. And if I rotate those controls, it's giving me the lock warning. Hey, it's not changing. So again, just a preference thing if you want to have the ability to lock certain controls. When we turn our camera off, do you want the mechanical shutter closing the sensor? I think it's a cool idea to help keep sensor dust off the sensor. So I have it default on, closed. Sensor cleaning, again, I'll demonstrate how to physically clean your sensor. If you were manually cleaning or physically cleaning the sensor, you would come to clean manually and it would open the shutter and you would have access to the sensor to clean it. The auto clean features are a little bit different. Think of it as a vibrating filter over the sensor that kicks off the sensor dust. We can clean it now. We could select this to clean it now. And the auto cleaning happens when we turn the camera off. So if we wanted to turn the camera off, we would get this cleaning notification. We can also have the cleaning feature turn on when we turn the camera on, or we can turn this feature off completely. I'm going to leave it at power off only. We can reset the camera to its factory default by selecting Reset Camera. Custom shooting we talked about to set up your C1 through C3. We would set the camera up the way we like, come into this feature and register the settings for that position. We can also clear the settings, and we can also turn on a feature that will allow us to update those settings. So as we're changing those controls, it would remember the changes. Come back out. Battery information is that as the battery ages, we would start to see some fatigue in it as indicated where these green boxes are. And at some point, if you shoot long enough, the battery will eventually, it won't really hold a charge. It won't really last very long. We can also get some other information, a serial number. Pretty cool. Copyright information allows us to embed our name and our copyright details into the EXIF meta files of every image we take. So if you wanted to include your copyright, you could. You would come in here, type your company name perhaps. Hit OK. Get back out. If you wanted to get the manual and the software URL for the camera, here's the QR code. Certification logo display. Typically we see In this case, the FCC has certified and ruled that it's compliant. There's no feature in there. It's just saying, this is the certification. Firmware. Eventually, there is going to be a firmware update, and this is the first version of the R5. And so the new version would be like 1.01. They'll address maybe the heat issues or something like that. And so the way this works is that we download the firmware, get it onto a memory card, we put the memory card into the camera, and the camera would recognize the new firmware and we would update it. It's changing the software of how the camera operates. We also have the ability to do it for the lenses, and we see lens improvements occasionally depending on the bugs and issues. But this allows Canon to improve the software that is running the physical camera in the lens. And that is our yellow tab. Now we come to the orange tab, which deals with the custom settings of the camera. And the short answer on this is by default, if you're a beginning or intermediate photographer, don't worry about anything in here. I'll go into depth of what these things mean on the crash course if you actually want, the definitions and how to tweak them. But the truth of the matter is I don't really change any of these personally, none of them. We do have the ability to customize the buttons, but I've showed you different ways to access those buttons and dials. If we come in here and we change something and we're not happy with it, we could clear the custom functions and it would reset it. Which brings us to the My Menu tab. This is a green tab that allows us to customize one tab of the menu. And we do this by coming in and we're saying, okay, we're going to add this. Let's come into configure. We can rename the tab if we wanted to. But the way this works is that we select things we want to register. Let's say image quality. We'll just put that in there just as an example. And maybe our ISO speed settings. There that is. And highlight tone priority. There it is. I'm just, as an example, saying these things. We're going to come back out. We can then sort the order of that. I like image quality at the top, but let's say I wanted my ISO speed settings to be third. I could move it there. I can delete items. I could delete all the items in the tab. I can even delete the tab. But in any event, after I set this up, I now have a page under the green tab that I have those three settings that I can jump to. And the idea on this is that you don't have to go wading through, 100 different features to find the one that you want. Maybe you would format your memory card and a couple others that you change regularly. And then you would just access the green tab. And that is really nice. Something else I also want to point out is that when you come to page 2 of your My Menu tab, you have the ability to display by default the My Menu tab, okay? Which means that as you're shooting, if you hit menu, it jumps just into the green. So I just wanted to point that out. Or you can display only from the My Menu tab. So having shown you all of the menu features, I do have to point out that in video mode, the menu does change, and in other modes, the menu changes. So let's say I come to dummy mode and I just select, hey, we're going to shoot in dummy mode, and I come into the menu. Well, now you'll notice that we're missing a number of pages and tabs. I can't tell you how often I get emails, hey, how do you get the page and the tab? I say, yeah, you're probably on the automatic mode, and that's one of the reasons why you're not seeing it. So keep that in mind, is that the menus change according to the mode we're in. And a quick way to change to video mode is just hit the mode button and then info, and then we're in it. Tap the shutter button. Really quick way if you're into efficiency. Now we're in the video mode, and when I press the menu button, we retain our My Menu, but you can see that the still features are grayed out. We only have highlight tone priority, which is coming back into the video stuff. You will notice that our page 1 is now different. Instead of having our quality settings, we have our resolution. So we can come in and determine the resolution on the top row. This is the pixel dimensions. So we got our 828K standards. We have our 4K. And then we have standard HD, full HD. We can also then come in and access the frame rates. So we have the ability to go from 60 frames per second, 24 and 23 frames per second. We also have the ability to choose the compression on the bottom. So in the sub menu, when we come out, we have the high frame rate. So we can come in here and select the high frame rate, And now you can see it's kind of locked us into that 4K 120. We can't really change much in terms of those settings, just whether it's the DCI or the UHD. Slightly different resolution widths. I'll be giving some slow motion demonstrations about how to use this and how to make it work. Come in here when we turn this back to disable. And we also have the 4K high quality mode. This is going to be pretty important because the image quality in the tests that I've seen and done are better. 4K HQ is better. It also heats the camera up a little bit faster. With this disabled, it looks okay most of the time. It just depends on how detailed and how nitpicky you are. The difference between the two is how the image is put together. So line skipping is that when different lines of the resolution are basically thrown out. And so when you throw out, every third line it softens the image. So it doesn't look quite as sharp as the camera is reprocessing. When we have a high quality mode, what's happening is the image is compressed individually as a frame, and that retains a lot of the resolution and detail. Movie cropping allows us to crop the center of the image out. For example, if we're adapting over an EFS lens, which was designed for a crop sensor, and we wanted to use it to record video, we would come in here and select enable. When we do this, we lose certain features in terms of the resolution, the high frame rate, things of that nature. Just be aware that you can crop the video, but I'm going to set this to disable for now. Sound recording. This has to do with our gain for our microphone. I have it on manual as I demonstrated early. We're avoiding the red clipping out. We can turn on the wind filter or the attenuator if we want. So some of these things are the same. We have our ISO speed settings for video, our HDR PQ settings. We have 8 stop increments if we want to get really precise when we're changing our exposure settings. I'm just starting to look through what else we have in here. Canon log settings. If we're shooting in Canon log, this is going to give us the ability to post-process our video with greater detail. A view assist would turn on what it would look like if it was processed. The Canon log, it looks kind of faded, a little gray. It's losing some of the sharpness and saturation, and the view assist allows us to see what it would look like if it was graded. We have different color matrices, different characteristics in terms of the sharpness, the saturation, and hue. I think most beginning photographers, this is probably going to be too much. This little grayed out feature on the bottom, BT.709, is the color sampling that's used with Canon log. It's just letting us know. Come back in and turn that off. We have our clarity setting. Many of these settings apply to video the same way they would apply to stills. So lens aberration correction, high ISO noise reduction. HDR movie recording, if it's turned off, the reason is it wants the camera to be in a full HD IPB compression mode. So if we come in, and there's really no way for you to know this unless you're like reading the manual in depth. So I'm gonna hit OK. So I got that set up. Come back, and here is our HDR recording mode. The time-lapse movie, I'll be demonstrating this on the crash course. We turn this on. Again, very similar to the intervalometer settings that we saw. The difference is this is going to combine it into a movie. We can choose between 8K, 4K, or high def. And again, I'll be demonstrating it with the sunset. It's a pretty cool feature if you know you're going to be making a movie with it. Movie self-timer. See, it's on time-lapse. And that's the cool thing is when things are grayed out, if you hit the set button, it'll tell you what the conflict is. So it didn't like that I set up the time-lapse. Come in here, turn that off. We should be good to go. And there it is. It's just a little timer that allows us to record. It gives us a little bit of a delay. There's also a remote control that we can use to start and stop video recording. So the image stabilizer mode is dealing with the digital image stabilization. We've talked about that a little bit. It's going to zoom in and crop your image out a little bit. If we're shooting at 8K, we've got a lot of room to play with. And I know there are some instances where people like to use this because they couldn't get the shot other way. They're hand holding the camera and they're walking around. They just want to, stabilize it from the get-go. It's one of those things that, you'd have to probably test out to know what you're losing in order to gain that. We can use the shutter button function for movies with a halfway shutter, metering and turning the EAF on, or start and stop video recording. I don't have a problem with that. Pretty cool. Again, our metering timer, similar. It's when the exposure settings disappear from the screen. Zebra settings are very powerful. So the way that zebras work is that when this is turned on, I'm going to choose zebra pattern 2. So when I get to 100%, what that basically means is that when the image goes over 100%, when it's more than white, we're going to start seeing these marching lines. So I'm just going to do it with the ISO bump the ISO up. So we get these diagonal lines all over the screen. And this is an exposure setting. So this is a way to see the exposure if it's no go. Kind of a cool feature. We have our shooting information display, similar to what we set up in the still shooting aspect. This just applies to video. Come back out. And the same thing for our viewfinder. Coming into page 8, we have our overheat control. I think we're going to be hearing something from Canon, but this prevents the camera from basically overheating. And so when it starts to get hot, it's going to warn us, and then it's eventually going to shut it down. I think it's a good idea to leave it on for now if you're doing video recording. Still dealing with a lot of unknowns. We don't know how Canon's going to respond to it, but for now, I'd say definitely leave that on. HDMI display. Do you want it to display only on the HDMI recorder, or do you want it to display on both the camera and the monitor? And then we have our time code options for beginning videographers. I would say don't worry about this for now. I'll be going into some of these definitions on the crash course and telling you the differences between them. In any event, that is a quick overview of the deep menu system, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let's talk about connecting our smartphone in the case of an iPhone X or iPhone 10 to the R5. This is going to work similarly depending on the phone that you have. If you are on iOS, it's the Canon Camera Connect app. It looks like this. Also, Android versions are available. You need to have that app installed on your smartphone for this to work. We are going to come into the purple tab. Now, there are some other things in here that are pretty cool, like GPS device settings. There is no GPS in the R5, but we could put a GPS receiver on there. We can also pair it with the smartphone if you want to embed GPS information into your images. So the connection, we're going to come in, select smartphone. It tells us change your Wi-Fi to enable. Now, basically what this is saying is if you don't have the app installed, here's a direct QR code so you can get it. Here's the truth about Bluetooth. I've never had a lot of success with it. I almost always connect with Wi-Fi. We're going to hit OK. This is going to turn the Wi-Fi transmitter of the camera on, and it gives us the name of the Wi-Fi signal with a password. So with this in mind, I need to come into the settings of my camera, my Wi-Fi settings, and select the camera to connect to. So here's the Wi-Fi setting. Michael the Maven's Wi-Fi network. I am going to select the R5 network, and it's asking for this password right here. Obviously, these numbers. Your numbers are going to be different depending on the camera. We're going to hit join. It says it's waiting to connect. Start the Canon app software. So I'm going to open the Canon Camera Connect app. Here's the app. I'm going to open it. So my smartphone connected to the Wi-Fi recognizes it in the app now, and it's saying, hey, connect this camera. And now they're communicating a little bit. It says, do you want to connect the smartphone? So the idea of this is so that people can't hijack your camera, even if they knew the password. There has to be, you have to press OK on both of them. So the connection is established. We get this notification to disconnect. I'm going to hit OK. And then we get these items available. The best feature, in my opinion, just one man's opinion, is the remote live view shooting. So we're going to activate that. And this allows us to control the camera from the smartphone. I am shooting in RAW right now. I know this because this was the setting that I had set up. But you can see that we are able to toggle on and off these different settings. We have another setting control wheel up here. But the main thing about this is we can autofocus. We can take pictures. We can change our shutter speed remotely. We can change our aperture remotely, ISO as well. We can tap on the screen to change our focusing point. And it's telling us, the inner square box is telling us when it's focused. Very useful. You'll notice on the bottom here, if you're not seeing this, you can toggle these up and down, is we're on a high burst mode. Let's go to a single image. Maybe we want to change the focusing square we're using, the size of it. And see, it's a little bit different than what it looked like on the camera. There's face detection and tracking. Very nice. There are drives, high-speed burst, timer. We can go to a manual focus using these little arrow keys. I don't know why it's not letting us change RAW. Let me see if we can do it from the camera without losing our settings. Sometimes it won't let us do that. Go to JPEG. Okay. There it goes. Okay. We can see the last image that we took. It's telling us that it's a raw image. Close that out. So all in all, pretty cool. You can see that when we went back to JPEG, we get tons of images. We get actually more images remaining on the smartphone than we do on the camera. We're at 16,000 images remaining. Another cool thing about this is that we can shoot in video. We can start and stop video recording. I'm overexposed, obviously, so we'd want to turn our ISO down a little bit. We can start recording. We get our audio levels. I've used this before where I need to be in the frame and I'm not behind the camera. I'll actually turn on the smartphone app and I'll look at the phone to frame myself up. Very nice. Stop recording. Let's see, what else can we do here? So on the video settings, we can change our white balance. We have our different movie settings. Obviously, we can't record in 8K directly to the phone. This is for recording on the camera. Very nice. We got our attenuators, things of that nature. If we click on this camera setting icon, we can lock the screen orientation. We can rotate the view. So if you're shooting in a vertical aspect, if you wanted to do that, we can mirror live view display. We have magnification and touch autofocus. We're going to rotate this. Continue to rotate it around. Very good. So let's come out. Let's go back to stills. And as you noticed, when we're recording things, at some point we may want to drop them into our smartphone. So how do we transfer images? So if we come into images on camera, it's going to load the previews of the shots we've taken. Obviously, we have some video here. And we can do some things here on the bottom, kind of hard to see. We can display different types of data in terms of, this was a video file recorded for 14 seconds. We can give it a rating. Let's find another image. Let's find something like this. We can send it to different apps, such as the printer, for example. If we wanted to print directly from the camera. Got our date, time, delete. Very nice. Very cool. We can scroll through. So this is a way that we're able to transfer images from the camera to our phone. So let's go ahead and do that. If we wanted to transfer, we'll just import. There it's importing the image. Great. Let's see if it would do it for that video file. Import. Yep. It's the smaller, this is a full HD and it's a smaller video file. So I'm not sure how big the files are that we can transmit. Obviously, the bigger the file, the longer it's going to take. But overall, you can see it's a pretty smooth experience. We get the downloaded symbols up there, jump, sort, and filter. Coming back out, there are a couple other features out here, just real briefly. There's an auto transfer feature. I personally don't want that. But if you wanted the images to be auto transferring to your phone as you're shooting, you would turn this on. I have the reduced image size turned on automatically. So these are going to be smaller files. Obviously, if this was turned off, then we would get the full resolution. And we can delete the location information from the image. There is no GPS, built-in GPS to the camera. We either have to get the module or have it run from the smartphone. But this is pretty smart to delete the information from the image before you share it on social media, because sometimes people can go in there and find out where you were when it transferred. Just something to keep in mind. Location information has to do with intentionally embedding GPS coordinates into the files. It is battery heavy both for your smartphone and your camera when you do this. And so it's detecting current location. And so when I take pictures now, it will embed it into the images themselves. It's a very handy, powerful tool if you need it. And there have been some situations where I needed GPS data, being plugged into the images. But for now, and for most cases, I leave it turned off. And then we can come into the different camera settings. We have access to reflect the date and time. We can adjust the date and time. Pretty cool. The area, daylight savings, things of that nature. Other things that we have up here, we have just some minor information, nothing too hardcore. And then we can disconnect by pressing this little X. In any event, that is a quick overview of connecting our smartphone to our Canon R5 for remote shooting and image transfer download to the smartphone. When we're talking about lenses for the RF mount, the mirrorless mount, there are a few important things to keep in mind. Canon has a ton of great affordable lenses for the older EF mount. So when you're purchasing a lens, absolutely make sure that you're reading the description to make sure which Canon lens it is. I have a video that goes through some of the more popular RF lenses. We published it this year, and I'll have to remake another one because so many other lenses have come out since that time. I'm going to make the assumption that if you can afford this camera, you can afford some of these nicer lenses, but it is an absolute no-brainer to get the EF to RF adapter. The reason why that's important is you can find them for less than $100, and it's going to allow you to adapt the older Canon EF lenses onto the RF mount. And for the most part, the focusing is pretty good. It's pretty great. If you're doing sports types of photography, I would probably recommend sticking with the RF lenses. They just seem to be a little bit faster and a little bit more accurate. Something else to keep in mind is that we're dealing with a 45 megapixel sensor, and Canon published a list of lenses when they came out with their high megapixel 5DS and 5DSR in 2015. And they basically said, make sure that you use lenses from this list. And the reason is some of the older Canon zooms will not have the resolution to get the sharpness, to maximize the potential sharpness of the sensor. So keep an eye on that list. That said, the RF lenses are super sharp. I think you're going to probably be in good hands if you go with a native RF mount. I like the 24-105 as a general shooter. I've had a few of these now. They have all been super sharp, very impressive, and they go up in cost and quality from there. If you're a wedding photographer, there are a number of great lenses you're going to want to consider, including the 24-70 2.8. You're obviously going to want the 70-200 2.8. It's a much smaller, more compact mid-range zoom. There's a 100-500 if you need a little bit more reach. Canon has announced and released the 600 and the 800 f11 primes. It's not really a wide aperture, but it is a light, affordable way to get very close to the action if you're shooting outdoors. If you're looking for a wide angle zoom, look at Canon's 15-35 2.8. Now, obviously, these lenses are very expensive. There are some more affordable general purpose shooting lenses. There's the brand new 24-105. Its aperture is not as wide, but it's a good way to get started if you have nothing else. If you are an event, wedding, or portrait photographer, at some point you are going to want to invest into a speedlight. Canon 600 EXRT is the one I would recommend. There's an older version, there's a version 1, there's a version 2. I have a crash course on that with the STE3 transmitter that will take you through all the steps to learning it. It's an expensive flash system. It is the best, most compatible with Canon's cameras. There is a company called Godox, and if you are going to go the Godox route, it's the TT685C. In the past, I have had a tremendous amount of success using those speedlights, $110. So, if you want to save a few $100 right there, that's the way to go. They also have their own transmitter. It's called the X Pro C. I'll include some of the basics of using speedlights on the crash course for the R5. If you don't have a tripod, you are definitely going to want to get one. I would recommend investing into something a little bit more sturdy. I like the carbon fiber ones by Bogen Manfrotto. The ball head that I like, it's just personal preference. It's the Bogen Manfrotto 496 RC2 or the equivalent. It allows me to lock the camera in different angles and positions. I use it all the time for landscape photography. If you want to maximize the capabilities of the R5, you should invest into a CF Express card. They are expensive. I give the same advice about memory cards to all of my students, is to buy the biggest, fastest one that you can afford. Now, the UHS-2 cards are way affordable. You can get a very large capacity memory card, a very fast UHS-2 memory card, which is going to be great for stills and up to 4K video. But when we get into the raw video files and the higher data rates, that CF Express card is the only way to go. You will also probably want to invest into a CF Express card reader. Obviously, we can transfer without taking the memory card out of the camera, but for larger files and for the speed of workflow, get the card reader. If you enjoyed this free tutorial on the Canon R5 and you want to learn more, check out my Canon R5 crash course. It comes with a 100% money back guarantee. I will put that link in the description. I thank you guys so much for watching. It's been a pleasure to teach you about this great camera, and I hope to see you in the Facebook group.